As a wake-up call for markets. Matt.
Take a look at futures now. We had a big drop below 1% in futures on this news. They've come back just a little bit, but still FTSE futures are down 1% and DAX futures are down 0.8%. U.S. futures also turned much lower instantly after these headlines came out. Let's take a look at the live cash trade on the global macro movers screen. And this is a series of risk assets across each column. Interesting to see in terms of Forex what's happening as the dollar gains strength there. But the far left-hand column is the equity indexes. You can see the FTSE has already opened live cash trade down 6 or 0.7%, and expect the other equity indexes to open lower as well. I will say that as something this surprising comes out, it does often take a little bit longer for these equity indexes to open up. So you've got 1% drops now on the CAC, the IBEX, and the FTSE. So Paris, Madrid, and London all trading down more than 1%. It may take a little bit longer this morning for Frankfurt to open up the DAX. We also typically see the AEX out of Amsterdam open already at this time. We typically see the FTSE MIB open at this time. It's now down 1.25%. You can see at the top left of your screen there. So we are seeing drops across the live European trade as expected. And in fact, those drops are bigger than futures had indicated. Danny Berger joins us with more market reaction. Danny, stocks dropping across Europe, futures down in the U.S., and we see money flowing into safe havens, don't we?
That's right, and you'll have to forgive me because I have GMM up again, but for one specific reason, I want to point out a really interesting cross-asset move, and that's what's happening in Russia. So yesterday, SEB analysts came out saying that a Biden win would be negative for the ruble and for Russian stocks, for Russian assets in general, because they see a Biden administration less favorable to Putin. Well, we are seeing a bit of that reaction. The ruble down 0.8% versus the dollar. Russian stocks down nearly 2% as well. So if you believe what SEB says, and that is a negative for Russian assets if Biden becomes president, you'd have to imagine that some of this pricing perhaps is a view of a shift in Biden's favor with the recent news that President Trump has contracted coronavirus. We're also looking at the yen, really one of the biggest foreign exchange moving assets this morning, up 0.5%, which you mentioned, man. Really an interesting discussion this morning about if you're going to go to a safe haven currency, is it the yen or is it the dollar? Well, we're seeing really lots of bids for the yen underneath the surface that's preferring this haven currency. Looking at volatility, this is 1 week expected volatility of the dollar yen cross. You can see it's spiked up now at 1.6%. There's a line of zero here. And look, it's by no means a historical spike. I mean, back here in July, the volatility pricing for 1 week was sooner. But these are traders who are gearing themselves for short-term volatility, again, because it is 1 week. So perhaps it's further out along the curve that people are worried about, or people just need to digest this news before they can understand whether or not they want to go in and buy protection. Now, finally, I want to show you what the polls have been doing. I talked about predict it before. Well, here I have real clear politics. And you can see earlier at one point, Biden on the white line here was at 55%, Trump at 45%. Now they are at 60 and 40%. Respectively. Stephen Innes of IXI says that he wouldn't be surprised if Biden's chances in the betting markets went to 90. That would really be a gigantic jump from where we are, but really interesting to see that at least the initial reaction for now seems to be one of increasing Biden's chances. We'll see how long that plays out. Again, it could just be that initial reaction. We certainly need more details to get a really good view on how these markets will react and where it makes sense to go for havens. Matt, Anna?
Danny, thanks very much. Danny Berger with the latest on how these markets are reacting. So 4 minutes into the European session, and European equity markets do move to the downside, down by more than 1% on the Stoxx 600. I'll pick up where Danny left off, though, with our next guest. Let's bring in Nanette Hechler-Federbe, Credit Suisse International Wealth Management CIO and Global Head of Economics and Research. Nanette, very good morning. So markets reacting very quickly, very swiftly to the latest news lines around the health of the president. Investors and those in betting markets drawing their own conclusions about what this does to the chances of Joe Biden in the election. Do you have anything like clear sight now to November, or do you just sort of hunker down in protection and wait for more details around the president's health because you simply can't see a way through to November from here?
I think it's certainly the good thing to continue thinking in scenarios. For sure, at the margin, it may very well influence the ability of Donald Trump to continue holding rallies, etc., according to plan. So it is completely intuitive that at the margin, Biden is gaining from these news in terms of polling results and all the other measures that you have already highlighted. But I think still it is important to go beyond that, because really what the market is looking at is two things, in my view. First of all, what are the chances of a sweep? And from an economic policy standpoint, and also looking beyond just the November results and the short term, it is what economic policy will it be about that is most important for financial markets, for the stock market as well in particular. And the second thing is what the indications are for the economy, because what can happen to Donald Trump can happen to any person in the economy. And it means that we are looking at the moment towards this period of the year where probably just due to the seasonality, we will be seeing more infections of COVID going up. And it may very well just emphasize this rollover of the economic momentum. So these two things, in my view, are equally as important as the math of the pollings, etc., that are very relevant for the short term.
Nanette, I want to ask you about a tweet from Global Times editor Hugh Ji-Shin, or rather, the fallout from this. It's just. Of course, the Global Times is a state-affiliated media organization, and he often says things that are obviously in China's corner and therefore, in some ways, a foe of the U.S. and President Donald Trump. This tweet was, I thought, pretty aggressive. He says, President Trump and the First Lady have paid the price for his gamble to play down the COVID-19. The news shows the severity of the U.S. pandemic situation. It will impose a negative impact on the image of Trump and the U.S. and may also negatively affect his reelection. As I say, you've got to take this with a grain of salt, considering Hugh Ji-Shin's position, who he is, and what he's trying to do. But for me, this raises the question, do U.S.-China relations get worse? Does this worsen the relationship between Beijing and Washington?
I think that in both scenarios, whether under Donald Trump or under Joe Biden, there has been a swing towards a harder line across the two parties in the U.S. towards China. And so the very tense relation that has now been developing over the last 2 years between the two countries is probably going to persist, and is just going to go through the ups and downs in much independence also of the overall state of the economy in both countries. I mean, if you think about the fallout on the labor market in the United States, it may very well be that protectionism just continues to uphold, and therefore these tensions just continue regardless of who is in the White House in the future 4 years.
Nanette, I wonder what this does to the fiscal stimulus story in the United States as well. There are different ways to view this, I suppose. On the one hand, there's just looking at the role of President Trump himself and the extent to which he is in charge of things. Does that have an impact? But also looking at what impact this might have on the underlying economy. If it raises the profile amongst people who'd preferred not to think about coronavirus or maybe even thought it was a hoax, maybe this does have some underlying impact on the US economy or on equities, and therefore there's an increasing need or argument for stepping in. I wonder what your thoughts are on the fiscal side and how this changes that calculation in Washington.
So it is probably unlikely that before Congress goes into recess next week that we will have really breaking news in terms of a next stimulus package. It may very well be that before the 3rd of November, they are being called again, and there might be a vote. It may very well be that the situation opens up more bipartisan, coming closer together from the extreme positions that they have held so far in terms of the size and also where to focus on the next stimulus. But really, I think what is happening with respect to expectations towards a stimulus package is that the likelihoods of a sweep election whereby the two houses, so the Senate as well as the House of Representatives, moves into the same camp as far as the majority is concerned. Let's just assume for a minute that this is a Democrat sweep. But regardless, the sweep would mean actually a higher chance of a stimulus package. And so probably at the margin, this would be seen and regarded as a positive in the first instance. Longer term, it depends, however, very much whether the sweep goes towards Democrats or, at this moment it seems less likely, but if it were to go towards Republicans, because the economic policy focus would be very, very different. In particular, the re-regulation that can be expected under a Democrat sweep and a number of other measures may then very well start to counterbalance the initial positives of the stimulus.
All right. Thanks so much, Nanette, for joining us. Really appreciate your time on this Friday morning amidst such breaking news and such market moves. Nanette Eschler-Feder from Credit Suisse International Wealth Management. Great to get your insights amidst such uncertainty. I'll just go ahead and recap what we have learned this morning. President Trump and his wife, the First Lady Melania Trump, have both tested positive for COVID-19. The president, his doctors say that the two are doing well, and the president will continue for now to work as usual. He'll be monitored very closely. Let's get more reaction with our Washington Bureau Chief, Craig Gordon. Craig, good morning, or I guess good late night to you. This is a bombshell for markets, of course, and it must be for the White House, which at times was seen as not taking COVID-19 quite as seriously as it could have. How do you think voters react to this?
Yeah, I mean, look, there's obviously, the President of the United States, whether you're a big fan of Donald Trump or not, is still the President of the United States, and now he's facing this this potential very serious health challenge. So I think some voters, will be very sympathetic to that. And I have a feeling it's going to kind of put a freeze on the campaign just for a little while, not just because Trump is physically off the trail, but just because, there's sort of it's a very odd moment in American life right now. we still don't know the full implications of this. I mean, Donald Trump's a very busy guy, talked to a lot of people. Amy Coney Barrett, his Supreme Court choice, had met with him not so long ago. The vice president, the chief of staff, a lot of people passed through the Oval Office, and so we're still trying to get our arms around just how many people might have been exposed to Donald Trump and what the implications are for that. But yeah, it feels like right now everything is kind of frozen, and we have to kind of get a little bit more of a handle on what is Trump's health condition, since we really don't know that many details right now.
What is the precedent? Good morning to you, or good evening to you, Craig. What is the precedent for a president being unable to campaign? This has happened in darker, with darker events taking place than this, I suppose, in U.S. history.
Yeah.
Is it the norm that in this situation both sides stop? We haven't heard yet from the Democratic campaign, I don't think.
No, and there's a bit of an irony here, which is that Joe Biden, the Democratic rival to President Trump for the presidency, of course, has been sort of ultra cautious in his approach to the virus and his campaign's approach to the virus. The Bloomberg news reporters who travel with Joe Biden routinely have to be tested repeatedly to sort of be on his campaign and in the presence of his campaign officials. And so there is a certain irony here that Trump, who was criticized for not taking the virus very seriously, has now contracted it, while Joe Biden is again maybe went even above and beyond, seems to be doing okay. I don't know that Joe Biden will feel the need to sort of stay off the road or kind of unilaterally disarm in that way. I do think for the next 24, 48, 72 hours, the nation will be in a little bit of a state of shock. Nobody much wants to hear from a presidential candidate of either party much right now. You have to remember, Donald Trump, spends a lot of time campaigning on Twitter too. So, he may still find a way to get his voice heard, but there is absolutely no doubt that, he was hoping. He's behind in the polls right now. Joe Biden has about a 7-point lead nationally. He's held that lead for several months now. Obviously, Trump needed to get back out on the trail, do some rallies, try to get his base stirred up for him again. That is all off the table. So it's hard not to see this as anything but, helpful to Joe Biden's chances of potentially winning this election. But as I say, I think for the next foreseeable future, no one's going to be talking too much about that as we try to assess the president's health.
Craig, except for the fact that, Jair Bolsonaro and Boris Johnson, two men, two world leaders who also didn't take the coronavirus threat as seriously as maybe they could have, and then contracted COVID-19, and then each saw higher approval ratings. Can't you take from that the fact that Donald Trump will at least get a fair amount of sympathy from voters?
Yeah, I mean, Donald Trump is a highly polarizing figure. So there are people who love him and people who hate him. Let's just be really upfront about that. There is a phenomenon in American politics. We sort of call it in my world as sort of the rally around the flag. Obviously, people may remember during the Gulf War, George H.W. Bush's approval rating was about 92%, unheard of. After 9/11, George W. Bush, his son, his approval rating spiked. So there is, whatever you might think about Donald Trump politically, there is a certain amount of he is the leader of the country. There may be some rallying around him. I have to say I'm not necessarily seeing that. I mean, it's hard to overstate how polarizing he is. The people, like I say, the people who love him, and the people who hate him kind of hate him. And obviously anyone can have just human sympathy for a person catching this incredibly dangerous disease. Donald Trump's not a young man. He's not a particularly healthy man. We don't know where this all leads. So, again, I think there's just a moment here when politics may be put a little bit on hold, but I guess standing here tonight, I would be a little surprised if there was a big sympathy factor for Donald Trump. He's not a terribly sympathetic figure. He's a very combative guy in the way he carries out his presidency and his politics. So, a lot we have to wait and see. But I do think the country right now will be trying to figure out, hey, how serious is this? Obviously, as you said, those two leaders got it, came out through the other side. Obviously, 200,000 people have died from this. So, here. So it's a very, very serious moment right now. The White House position is saying they're doing fine, they're doing well. Certainly people can come through this much more easily. I just think it's too early to tell that stuff until we know more about his medical condition. But I don't think it's going to fundamentally change the politics underlying the election, which right now is tilting a little bit in Joe Biden's favor.
Yeah, really interesting to think about those comparisons with the UK experience. That was a very different time in the pandemic, wasn't it? Back in April or so, Prime Minister Boris Johnson's approval rating was up at 66%, according to YouGov, now back down at 35%. So these things don't necessarily last. And it was a very different phase in the fight against coronavirus, but really interesting parallels to think about at this point. Craig, thanks so much for joining us. Washington Bureau Chief Craig Gordon with The View from Washington. Let's get to Danny Berger. She's got details of the VIX opening up and that measure of risk appetite, risk sentiment, the fear gauge. What is it telling us, Danny?
Anna, we already knew that volatility across currencies was popping today. Well, the VIX opening just minutes ago, a pop as well. There you're looking at October futures, but the VIX index itself up higher by 2 percentage points. That means it's the biggest gain for the volatility index in a month since September 3rd to be exact, and trading at 28.79. It still has not jumped above 30%. So it's going to be its highest level in less than a month. So sure, volatility moving higher, but by no means is this a catastrophic move to the upside yet. Still a lot of appetite for hedging, for volatility out there. I've been talking to Naeem Assalam of Ava Trade, and asking him, what do people want right now? He said, it's exuberant volatility. We have shifted into a higher gear. And he says, really anything you can get a hold of in the volatility space, that this is really a ticking time bomb situation right now. So that just gives you an idea of the sentiment there with Aslam's words. And he also points out that perhaps Trump will get some sympathy votes as well, which we were just talking about, Craig, earlier. So there is a lot of back and forth. There is a lot of uncertainty. And where do you go when there is uncertainty? The VIX is certainly a place where we see people flock to. Volatility tends to be perpetually low. It's been kicked up a bit more this year. But this event might be the next thing to take it a leg higher in terms of heightened volatility, heightened uncertainty. But again, I should remind everyone who's watching, we still haven't broken through the 30 handle yet. So yes, a pop, but not dramatic as of this point. Matt, Anna?
Danny, thanks very much. Danny Berger with the latest on volatility then. Let's get a Bloomberg First Word News update. Here's Laura Wright.
Thanks, Anna. Well, today's top story, President Donald Trump has tested positive for COVID-19. He tweeted that he and the First Lady, Melania, both have the virus and will isolate. It isn't certain how he contracted the virus, but it comes after a close aide, Hope Hicks, tested positive. She traveled with the president to the election debate and a rally in Minnesota. The president's doctor says he expects President Trump to continue carrying out his duties without disruption. He said the president and First Lady Melania Trump will remain at the White House, where the medical unit will maintain a vigilant watch. He says he'll update on any developments. It's unclear how President Trump's diagnosis will impact the election campaign. The test results will likely sharpen the already intense public attention on his handling of the pandemic. This will likely make it harder for the president to shift the campaign away from the virus to other campaign topics such as racial unrest across the country. That's the latest from our top stories today. Anna, Matt.
Laura, thanks very much. Laura right there with your top stories from the Bloomberg terminal. Now, President Trump will likely take more steps against China to maintain support from his voters following news he's tested positive for COVID-19. And it could lead to a series of aftershocks in markets. At least that's according to Nordea Asset Management. Sebastian Gailey, who joins us on the phone right now. Sebastian, we've seen a number of tweets from Chinese media that I think are fairly aggressive in terms of their condemnation of President Trump now that he's tested positive for COVID-19. Will this as well anger the president?
And you have to put in context. This is a real conflict between a country which is in expansion, which is China, and the world leader, which is the United States. And it's a battle for the top, and it's a battle which the president has basically been quite keen on going after, leading to a phase one trade deal, which of course has only partially succeeded. And so once faced with this, and faced confrontation, in a position of weakness, what you want to do is take back control of the narrative. And the easiest way to do it, for example, say the phase one trade deal, for example, is dead, or take other measures against China to regain the sense that he is in control, that the government is actually continuing to do its job, and that he eventually will become the president of the United States. So never underestimate it. When people are in a weak positions, the right reaction is to be very aggressive and to come back immediately, and this is most likely what he will do.
And so, Sebastian, good morning. What would you expect him to pick up then as his theme of attack against China, if that is indeed the direction he moves in? Do you think we go back to trade? Do you think we stick with the sort of Cold War topics, tech war, finance war, culture war, all of those well-trodden narratives over the last 12 months or so? Or are things in danger of turning hot?
There are a variety of things you can do, some of which are very efficient, such as cutting some of the dollar access of Chinese banks, for example. This is viciously effective, but it's not something in which will capture the imagination. Phase one trade deal will do the job, and there are things that it can do basically on financials and the likes, which are less harmful. So he can stagger it in to a series of uppercuts if you want it, or he can go for one blow at a time. My suspicion is he will go for one blow, and then probably he might consider the euro, but this is very much less likely because part of his base actually has German roots, and that's essentially what you hit in Europe if you're going to go after them. So more likely to be steadily focused on China, and the question there is whether it's a series of small shocks or average shocks, or it's one big blow followed by smaller shocks.
Now, Sebastian, it's not only the Trump base, it's not only Republicans that are angry at China about the pandemic, that are suspicious of China's spy capabilities, that are concerned about the possibility of China influencing the election. Some Democrats also harbor these feelings. What do you think the path is for Joe Biden against China should he win power?
We have to phrase it. There's what we observe and what we know, for example, that the president gets COVID-19 or tests positive on COVID-19, and what we don't know. And the people who are in power know a lot more than we do. And the Democrats, of course, have access to part of that information and are so aware of it. And that probably leads them to be somewhat aggressive against China, both for political reasons and for strategic reasons. So you can't expect a very significant shift between one administration to the next. And the next might actually be more aggressive in some ways than the current administration is. It's not only just appealing to the base, it's a geostrategic issue of the first order. If you allow a country like China to emerge over decades to become prominent, and the promise is if we let you work with us and we send you our factories, then you'll play with us. But the reality is that they have not, and hence you have a real first-class conflict between not only the United States and China, but the West and in China. Right now it's mostly the United States because there is no such thing under America first as allies. But eventually, if the Democrats do win, then it will be the West against China. So a very difficult situation for the next few years. Having said that, we're very bullish on the China rebound. It's just the politics are going to be difficult for the next few months.
Thank you very much, Sebastian. Sebastian Galli, their senior macro strategist at Nordea Asset Management, joining us there. We'll have plenty more coverage of this breaking news, of our coverage of what's happening with President Trump and Melania Trump, both of them testing positive for COVID-19. I just want to get to some other breaking headlines across the Bloomberg, just seeing that the EU's Ursula von der Leyen is to speak with the UK Prime Minister on Saturday. So we understand that there is an appointment in the diary between the two to speak. Is that a positive development? The pound has been led on a whipsaw really all week by talk of progress, a lack of progress, good relationships, poor relationships, EU legal action, but that wasn't dwelt on too much by either side. Just watching the pound now and seeing if we get any instant reaction. We see the pound has been down. It sold off along with other risk assets in the wake of that news around 6 a.m. London time around the president's health. We'll keep an eye on the pound. Obviously, we'll return to our top story as well around the president. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back. The European market open 30 minutes into your trading session, and European equity markets making losses, down around 0.5%. The top story, of course, is the President of the United States, Donald Trump, and his wife, Melania Trump, both testing positive for COVID-19. Both said, though, to be on good form and generally to have good health, so not adversely affected by this positive test just now, but we'll wait to see. Hope Hicks, who has been traveling with the President, one of his close aides, of course, has been displaying symptoms, so we'll see how this story develops. Of course, everyone in the market hanging on for details now of the health of the President of the United States. Just to add some further news lines, though, into the mix, we also see a big spike up in the pound coming through right now. The pound erasing its losses, which we saw in response to those earlier headlines around President Trump. The pound down by 0.3%, 129. Sorry, pound up 129.29 in response to these latest lines suggesting that maybe there's some reasons for hope around the Brexit negotiations, because Ursula von der Leyen and Boris Johnson are going to be meeting on Saturday. They must think they have enough to talk about to meet this weekend. Danny Berger has been looking at the markets in more detail. She's got some reaction.
And as one trader told me this morning, no one had a game plan for President Trump contracting coronavirus. And we're certainly seeing that gut punch reaction throughout markets today. I talked about this earlier, but Russian assets continue to move further into the red. Russian equities down nearly 2%, the ruble down 1%, steepening its losses. SEB saying yesterday, even before this news, that any increased chance of a Biden win would be negative for Russia because Biden is seen to be less favorable, less accommodating towards Putin. We continue also to see those havens get a bid. The yen up 0.3% versus the dollar, though this gain has come off a bit since this morning, again, giving us this idea that perhaps it was a lot of algo initial sort of trading, and now that the shock is starting to be processed, some of these things are coming off. Certainly are seeing, though, just across the board, risk assets doing worse. Brent crude and WTI down more than 2%. Now, moving into the havens and demand for protection, this is the October VIX. So this is if you want to see what volatility is going to be like getting closer to the election. It did have an initial pop higher, trading at a 1-month high. It's since come down a bit, but still when you look at the entirety of the curve, there's a really sizable kink around the U.S. election. In other words, people are diving in and saying, this is the period that I need to be protected for. But a lot of that volatility has also picked up on the front end because now we have near-term uncertainty. As Naeem Aslam of Ava Trade told me this morning that all of his clients are demanding havens. They want to get it anywhere they could because, in his words, this is now just a ticking time bomb. One of those havens, of course, is the yen. Here's the 1-week volatility for the U.S. dollar versus the yen. And you can see it spiked higher. But look, as we've been talking about, this isn't a historical move by any chance. It's not even really very, very dramatic. It spikes up to 1.6%, but we've had higher volatility in the 1-week yen just a couple months ago. Now, finally, one of the really interesting things to keep your eye on is the betting polls. At the moment, how it stands as of yesterday was 60% for Biden, 40% for Trump. This is real clear politics, but I was looking at Predicted earlier this morning. You saw similar things that the rest of the markets did, where you saw this really big push for Biden. All of a sudden, he was bid up, but that's starting to come back down, normalizing a little bit. But still, there seems to be a bit of a preference if you're going to bet on either candidate, that the polling markets, betting markets rather, now bidding in for Joe Biden. But again, is this all just initial gut punch reaction? How is this going to shake out throughout the day? Matt, Anna?
Well, and you saw a turnaround when you looked at Predicted, right? I mean, you saw on Predicted that Biden had been getting 66%, and then after this news, that dropped to what, 63%?
Yeah, exactly. Well, so Matt, exactly what happens is you get the news and you get that initial bump up to 66%, 66 cents. They kind of judge it by cents on a dollar. So you get that initial jump higher, but then what happens is a couple hours after the announcement, you have people looking at it and saying, okay, perhaps that move to Biden was overdone. So then they start to sell off, and we saw Biden drop to about 64 cents, and then Trump's drop also lessen a bit as well. So again, there's some normalization going on, or perhaps people just looking at it thinking they can make some quick money there because it was overbought in terms of Biden's odds.
Danny, thanks very much. Danny Berger with the latest then on the market response to President Trump and his wife testing positive to COVID-19. We're starting to get some European response and some well wishes, as you would expect to see at this point. So Charles Michel, EU president, saying he wishes President Trump and the First Lady a speedy recovery. COVID-19 is a battle we all continue to fight every day, no matter where we live. That in direct response to the tweet that President Trump himself put out a few hours ago. Let's get now to Bloomberg's US politics editor, Kathleen Hunter. Kathleen, still waiting for any response, I guess, from the Democratic side, although many people in the US clearly asleep at this point. We are watching the betting odds really move, though, on this, and you have to wonder whether that is, as Danny just said, some kind of knee-jerk reaction, or if this is a longer-term assessment of the chances of both sides.
Yeah, I think it's still early days to say, specifically how this is going to affect the election. I think really a lot hinges on, the extent to which the president actually becomes ill with symptoms of the virus, how long it takes for him to recover, and other factors that we just don't know yet. And so, of course, this is a seismic event for the election coming 30 days, just barely 30 days out. But I think that, we will need to see how this plays out over the weekend and into early next week to really know what, if any, political fallout there's going to be.
What do you think, Kathleen, about the response from China? I thought it was fairly aggressive, blaming Donald Trump and Melania Trump's COVID infection on his policies. Does this increase, does this worsen the relations between the U.S. and China?
Oh, I think absolutely. I mean, they were already, of course, quite tense and not good to begin with. But, I think in some ways, China's response, as you said, while aggressive, keep in mind that the president has spent months referring to this as the China virus, blaming China for its spread to the U.S. And so in some ways, I wouldn't necessarily characterize China's response as unexpected.
Kathleen, thanks very much. Bloomberg's US politics editor, Kathleen Hunter, on the initial news and indeed Chinese response. We haven't had any official Chinese response. We look for that as the morning continues here, European time. Joining us now with geopolitical analysis and weighing into the conversation at just the right moment, Leslie Vinjamuri, director of the US and Americas program at Chatham House. Leslie, very good to speak to you. Just take us back to basics here a little, if you could, and tell us where this leads the US election process. Are there rules, protocols, or just norms that we need to be aware of as to how this influences either the campaigning or the election itself? What do we need to know?
Well, I think first of all, we should say that we do all wish well President Trump, his wife, Hope Hicks, and all of those who have been near and in close proximity to President Trump in the last few days. We wish them well. This is a serious concern, of course, for especially older Americans like the president who are vulnerable to the effects of COVID-19. And remember that yesterday, President Trump traveled to New Jersey. He participated in a fundraiser. He was indoors with a number of close supporters. So we really do hold a lot of concern for the president and those around him. I think this is undoubtedly going to cast a great deal of uncertainty over the next few weeks. We are now just more than 4 weeks away from the most consequential presidential election this side of the Second World War. It's difficult to understate how significant it is to have a president sitting in the White House who is vulnerable to a pandemic that has killed more than 200,000 Americans. We are looking forward to October 7th, the vice presidential debate. I think even that will be uncertain. The optics of going forward in person, even at a social distance with a debate, just a week after the president debated Vice President Biden and may already have had symptoms. The test only came through just recently, and we don't know the other surrounding factors yet. And then October 15th, we're looking to the next presidential debate. Again, deep uncertainty, very difficult to imagine that going forward. Obviously, the president won't be campaigning in person. I think one of the most important things here is that we've had ambivalent, chaotic, and very mixed messages coming out of the White House. And this, in a sense, gives it clarity. The pandemic is real. September was a month where Americans and frankly many Europeans wanted to return to a kind of new normal. They wanted to go back to work, to begin to open up. And this sends a signal that, nobody is invulnerable. The President of the United States of America has been tested positive for COVID. It really sends a great deal of clarity to Americans, to Trump supporters that have, I think, been unsettled and perhaps taken a cue from the president that the pandemic is not serious. It clearly is serious. So I think, the personal, the public health effects and the effect from the campaign are very significant.
Is it fair to say that we had ambivalent and really not serious policies concerning the coronavirus in the UK as well? And did that change significantly after Boris Johnson contracted the disease? Because to those of us outside of the UK, it still doesn't look like Great Britain really has a great plan in order to stop the spread of this virus.
No, and as you know, we've had quite a difficult story this morning of an MP who was tested positive for COVID and traveled home on public transportation. I think what we did see after Prime Minister Boris Johnson was hospitalized and had quite a serious case of COVID, the UK did have a period of a very serious lockdown that really did have a very significant effect on the rate of infections. And the problem, of course, was when the UK came out of that lockdown, things like wearing masks. It took quite a long time for the government to send a signal that wearing masks was a very important and serious measure. And there was a lot of opening up without a great deal of restriction over the summer, quite a lot of travel. And we've seen the consequences of that in September. And you're right, there is still some uncertainty, a huge amount of debate, tremendous concern over the trade-off between the economic effects, which are disastrous and very grave for many sectors of the economy, and the public health effect. And that is still a debate that's going on. We're getting mixed messages. We know that there is disagreement inside the cabinet. That's crystal clear. I think the number one concern for most of the British public is, their health, the economic effect, and most importantly, allowing their children to remain in school for the entire academic year. A lot of American children, as we know, are home from school studying online. So the importance of leadership, if we've always known leaders are important. The signals that are set from the top, the policies that are sent, the optics, the images, there is nothing understating the significance of leadership in today's world. And God hope that we move forward now with this really extraordinary news from the White House in a way that really protects the public health of the people and allows us to have a secure election, which is incredibly important for U.S. politics right now.
Yeah, let me ask you a bit more about that, Leslie. And, if President Trump does become unwell with COVID-19 or worse, the election has already been set in motion, hasn't it? So is there, whatever happens, an election in early November in the United States?
Well, we certainly have to assume that there will be an election in November, and we have to assume that President Trump will come through his case of COVID-19. Obviously, one doesn't even want to consider that not being the case. But obviously, if he was unwell for an extended period of time, there will be questions. I think, the prospect of the election not happening is very, very low. But I think that the weeks leading up to it, I think in effect, it feels like at this point, in-person campaigning is likely to be over for the duration of the campaign, certainly from President Trump. It's difficult to imagine a president really returning to the campaign trail and rallies in the way that he has. Remember that there are going to be a lot of people who feel like they haven't had the trust, that the president hasn't given them the reason to have confidence and trust because he's been out in public, presumably, and we don't know for sure, but presumably knowing that Hope Hicks was unwell, that she was attempting to self-isolate on Air Force One. The amount of uncertainty that will create, and remember, especially for older Americans who are vulnerable and for vulnerable groups, older Americans are, largely supporting Vice President Biden at this stage. But it really kind of dampens any of that normal enthusiasm and rallying that we would see in the weeks leading up to a presidential election, certainly to this presidential election.
Leslie, what do you think would happen? I mean, in the case of Boris Johnson, his infection got very serious. He ended up in the ICU and intubated, or he ended up at least in the ICU, not on tubes. But it was harsh. If Donald Trump gets through this without that kind of issue, you know, if President Trump and Melania remain healthy, continue to work, even campaign, does that have the kind of effect, and this is a great question we got from a viewer just now, where you know, people think, okay, this virus isn't really a death sentence. Look, President Trump got it and he's fine. Is this the kind of thing where countries would then push, or states would push to reopen even more quickly?
I think, you know, I have to admit, it's a concern I've had even this morning. I think, you know, we'll wait and see. And again, we really hope that the president and his wife and all of those people who have been with the president, remember, he's been with many, many people in close proximity over the last several days. So it's not only the president, it's all of his supporters. We have to hope that they're okay. There is a concern, I think, of how the president handles this message in the days and weeks ahead. And what if he doesn't articulate that this is serious, even if the president has a mild case and his wife has a mild case, the implications for others who COVID-19 might spread to through social contact, either of the president or others. We know that any number of people don't have mild cases, that they end up in a very serious situation. So I think that communicating the message has always been phenomenally important. We've seen some people communicate it very effectively, Governor Cuomo, Dr. Fauci, and others, but we haven't seen our leaders communicate it in the way that we need to communicate it. And we can only hope that the president does that as a result of this. If he doesn't, and if the case is mild, of course, the public health implications of that could be quite serious for a lot of Americans.
Leslie, thanks very much. Thanks for your perspective this morning. Really good to get your thoughts. Leslie Vandermeury, Chatham House, US and the Americas Program Director, and she started out there by wishing the President and Melania Trump well, and of course we do that too. Let's get a Bloomberg First Word News update with Laura Wright.
Thanks, Anna. President Donald Trump has tested positive for COVID-19. He tweeted that he and the First Lady both have the virus and will isolate. It isn't certain how he contracted the virus, but it comes after a close aide, Hope Hicks, tested positive. She traveled with the president to the election debate and a rally in Minnesota. The U.S. House has passed the Democrats' $2.2 trillion fiscal stimulus bill. No Republicans supported the package, and negotiations with the White House have so far failed to reach a compromise. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi says the vote does not slam the door on discussions with Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin. The UK's dominant industry is lagging behind in the recovery. Services firms saw slower improvements than manufacturers in the third quarter. That's according to a survey by the British Chambers of Commerce. Hospitality and catering companies were particularly hard hit. It suggests the government may have to step up aid to prevent a collapse over the winter. Today is the last US jobs report before the presidential election, and it's projected to show a sharp slowdown in labour market gains. Employers probably added 875,000 jobs in the month. That's down from nearly 1.4 million in August. It suggests the election winner will inherit an increasingly shaky economic rebound. Global news 24 hours a day on air and at Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. This is Bloomberg. Anna, Matt.
Laura, thanks very much. Laura Wright here in London. Let's get back to the markets and the reaction to President Donald Trump's positive coronavirus test. Joining us now is Esti Dweck, Natixis Investment Manager's Head of Global Macro Strategy. Esti, as you look at the initial fallout from markets here, the initial reaction, very risk-off, as you might anticipate, are you looking a little further ahead? What is the time horizon that you can deal with this information over? Are you looking just up to November or beyond?
We try to look further out anyway, but of course, in this context, it is difficult, even before the diagnosis, it was difficult to think much further past November because we could have such different outcomes depending on who wins the election. Following President Trump's diagnosis, I think at this point, it shouldn't make a big difference for the election. But as was said previously, it's really going to be a question of, does he actually get ill and develop symptoms? Does it have an impact on his campaign? But broadly speaking, we have two candidates that are so far apart in terms of their views, in terms of their policies. Few are likely to switch views or change their vote based on this. So at this point, it doesn't really change the outlook. I think the big question, and especially in the short term, the big question is really about the next phase of fiscal stimulus and whether this is yet another hurdle towards getting this CARES Act 2.
Right, because the concern would be that he's not healthy enough to work on some sort of bipartisan agreement. Of course, we know that Nancy Pelosi pushed through a Democrats-only package in the House, but that doesn't really get us any closer to the goalpost. So what needs to happen for fiscal stimulus to be agreed?
Well, you know, as long as Pelosi and Mnuchin are talking, it's already positive. It means they understand how necessary this CARES Act is, and that given some of the recent data, even though it's really not been that bad, it's pointing in the direction that we are going to need this next wave of stimulus, and that maybe it isn't the best idea to push it back a number of months waiting for the election. But we're going to get pressure ahead of the re-election campaigns for a lot of people in Congress. We're going to have pressure from the markets, clearly. This is President Trump's positive diagnosis and maybe yet another one, just trying to avoid all these distractions and really just get together understanding that it's not optional. And the reality is we will get fiscal stimulus. It's a question of timing at this point.
One of the assets that we're seeing most reaction in right now, SD, is in oil prices. So we see Brent prices down by just over 3% in this morning's session. Is that an underlying assessment of the global economic story around the possibility of lockdowns intensifying? If the White House is acutely aware of the dangers around this virus, does lockdown in the United States to some degree and across some geography, does it become more likely? Is that what we're seeing, or is this just still knee-jerk reaction, still just part of the traditional risk-off playbook?
Well, oil prices have been retreating for a couple of weeks already, so I think this is an extension of concerns about growth and the fact that demand isn't going to pick up as much as anticipated, that growth is probably going to be even a bit softer than expected in Q4, especially if we don't get the next phase of U.S. fiscal stimulus. So it's not a surprise to see oil markets react. Now, some of it, of course, this morning is going to be maybe a bit knee-jerk, maybe a bit extreme. We really have to wait and see a few days how things develop. But the initial reaction isn't surprising.
What do you think about the concerns the China relationship will worsen with this, SD? And how do you think investors react to that? We've already heard from a number of state-run media outlets or state-affiliated media outlets some pretty harsh comments about Trump contracting COVID-19, and no doubt the president isn't going to take that lightly.
You know, hopefully the president is more focused on, you know, his reelection and fiscal stimulus and trying to, you know, stay healthy or get better if he does develop some symptoms. Relations between the two countries weren't fantastic to start with. It's not a surprise to see a bit of a deterioration, whether it's sparked by these comments or something else. Heading into the election, we knew tensions were probably going to rise a little bit, but hopefully it doesn't change materially. And I still do not think we're going to see any kind of very strong actions that would have a direct economic impact so close to the election in an economy that clearly needs all the support it can get.
Esti, thank you very much. Esti Dweck, Head of Global Macro Strategy and Natixis Investment Management. Thank you very much for joining us. Let's pick up the conversation and break down some more of the market reaction with John Authers, our Senior Editor for Markets, still up in New York. John, thank you so much for giving us the tail end of your Thursday. It probably is right now.
Not for much longer, but yes, carry on.
Not for much longer. Okay, well, let me go back to one of the things we talked about a couple of hours ago, and that was around fiscal stimulus. Putting aside maybe if we should, the role of President Trump himself in this, or maybe that's crucial. I wonder if the White House is about to get a full-on experience of COVID-19 in the sense that there's been a lot of mixing and mingling of these people and aides and politicians, and there could be further infections to be reported coming out of this. I wonder if that will change the calculus and get people, bash a few heads together in Washington and result in some kind of fiscal stimulus to replace the earlier CARES Act. Is that something the market is thinking about?
I think at this point the market is probably thinking that lots of things that weren't particularly possible or particularly likely a few hours ago are much likelier now. And I think, as I personally was fairly bearish about the chances of anything happening on the fiscal front, and I think most of the prevailing opinion was with me on that. Plainly, this really shakes things up and can only help, it can only, for this, from where we are now, it plainly improves the chances of some real stimulus happening just by forcibly rearranging the players. I mean, there's always a risk that the White House absolutely goes into mothballs because it affects too many people. But I think you're right. The best chance here is that it probably does act to focus minds and makes for a much clearer and more streamlined negotiation. So I do think on balance this is good news for a fiscal stimulus.
John, thanks very much. Appreciate you staying up until 4 o'clock in the morning in New York to talk to us. John Authors, our senior editor for markets in New York, been up all night covering this, breaking this developing story. Anna?
Yeah, but just getting a red headline, Walmart to sell Asda to TDR Capital Consortium for £6.5 billion. This according to UK broadcaster Sky, so we'll watch for that one. But the big story, of course, that we need to return to, the health of President Trump. He is said to be in good health at this point, but he and Melania Trump both tested positive for COVID-19. They now quarantine. What does this mean for the US election? This is Bloomberg.
The U.S. president tests positive for COVID-19. Donald Trump tells his Twitter followers that he and the First Lady have both tested positive for the virus. Markets sink after the revelation. U.S. futures drop. European stocks are lower. The election is just over a month away. Treasuries and the yen gain. Money floods into havens as president's positive test acts as a wake-up call for the markets. Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to Bloomberg Surveillance. I'm Francine Lacqua here in London. Now, we did have that rather surprising news. A lot of focus, of course, is on how it could upend the situation and how it will impact, of course, the markets going forward into November 3rd, election date. Now, we still know very little about the symptoms, if any, that President Trump has, so that gives us a little indication of actually what will happen next. It could have an impact at the polls. We could see him stop campaigning for the next 2 weeks, if not longer. It could also have an implication for the ballot if something were to escalate. European stocks down some 0.3%. You can see S&P futures also down, and then VIX, one of the measures that we look at for volatility, is gaining as the market is trying to recalibrate exactly what that means. Now, let's get straight more on the markets with Danny Berger. Hi, Danny.
Hi, Francine. That's right. We're definitely seeing this reaction, starting with a gut punch, just continue to bleed into the red for the rest of the day. Yes, U.S. futures are lower, but interestingly, what's doing worse right now are Russian assets. The Russian stock index down more than 2%, the ruble down more than 1%. Yesterday, SEB, of course, before this news, strategists at SAB said a Biden win would be negative for the ruble because a Biden presidency is seen to be less favorable towards the country. So we actually are seeing that get bid in right now. But more than that, the question is, what sort of volatility will this bring? Is it a time to move into havens? And we certainly are seeing that, Francine. The yen up 0.3%. Other risk assets selling off in the meantime. Brent crude and WTI continuing to slide this morning. A couple hours ago, they were down about 2%. Now both of them are down about 3%. Both of them trading under $40 a barrel. I guess there's a question of what sort of consequences this could have in terms of passing stimulus and the effect on the economy afterwards. Now, I mentioned havens and volatility. We are seeing a move higher in the volatility space. Here's the October contract for the VIX. So this is if you want to get short-term volatility protection. Initially, when we get the news, we get a pop in this contract. It trades at a 1-month high. It is starting to ease off. As Paul Di Vierno of UOB told me, he doesn't understand why things are selling off so extremely right now. We still don't know enough detail. So perhaps that's some of the sentiment you're seeing there coming off the markets. But I talked to another foreign exchange and derivative strategist and trader, Naeem Aslam of Ava Trade, who told me that his clients, they want protection right now. They want volatility. Exuberant volatility are the words he used, and they'll take it wherever they can get it, be it the VIX or yen volatility. Here's the US dollar yen 1 week volatility, and you can see this likewise had a very large pop at the start here. But here's what I will say. Okay, yes, we get about 1.6% on this currency cross, but look, even over the past month, we have had a more extreme reaction. So I think part of this right now is just trying to digest the news, figuring out what it means and what it means for the polling markets, because that's one of the keys here, right? How should you use this right now to bet on who will become president? Well, the last we saw it for Real Clear Politics, Biden polling at 60, Trump at 40. The live data we have has showed those odds start to move even further apart, Francine.
Danny, thank you so much. Now let's talk the markets and, of course, the political implications of this breaking story. Joining us straight is Sonia Loud. She's Chief Investment Officer at Legal & General Investment Management. And on the phone, we have Lou Lukens. He's a Senior Partner for Signum Global Advisors and also previously Deputy Chief of Mission of the U.S. Embassy in London. So thank you both for joining us. Sonia, let me actually kick off with you. When you look at the markets, I mean, we have so many questions, so little answers. What does it mean for what you want to buy today and have in your portfolio?
You're absolutely right. There's lots to digest, and let's face it, it's not just politics, right? There has been a lot of news flow around virus developments, around economic developments, and the market is really now trying to bring it all together. And obviously, the last thing we need right now is political uncertainty on top. And we have to wait and see how the Trump situation develops and how this will impact the expectation around, obviously, the final weeks of campaigning and the presidential election. As we know, this has been so far on the back burner for the majority of the year. It's clear that it's now coming back with much greater impact. And as such, I wouldn't be surprised to see volatility continue. And hence, we've just heard it, more focus on protection to make sure that we are then having a bit of dry powder when we have greater clarity around politics. Should not forget Brexit is on the agenda as well, and I'm sure that will feature in some of the talks as well.
Lou, talk us a little bit about, how you view this. So we know that for the majority of people, you stay healthy, but you're uncomfortable for, 2-3 weeks. For the few unlucky, it gets more severe. How does this impact campaigning? How does this impact voting?
Thank you. Those are great questions. And I think as your guests have said, we're sort of in uncharted territories here. Look, if President Trump is able to quarantine for a couple of weeks and recover and hit the campaign trail again, I think this will have minimal effect on the presidential election and the race. If, however, he is more incapacitated, and certainly if he's incapacitated to the point that Mike Pence has to at least temporarily take over as president, that'll have huge implications on the election. And I think either scenario probably works to the benefit of Joe Biden, who, as you noted, is polling well ahead in the polls anyway. And I think President Trump's dismissiveness of the virus and of sort of standard protocols to protect against the virus will come back to haunt him, because now that he has it, it sort of takes away one of his big talking points that the Democrats have overreacted to the virus. So, I think all of us wish the president well. This is a very unusual time in American political history to have the president with a potentially very serious illness at any time, let alone this close to an election. The next debate will be canceled because that's within the quarantine period. So we know for sure that there will not be a debate on the 15th of October, and the president will have to stop campaigning for a couple of weeks. It'll be interesting to see what the Biden camp does. Does Vice President Biden also take a break from campaigning out of sympathy, or does he dial it back? So there's a lot that's unknown that I think will become clear as the day goes on.
Lou, if the first couple and his family remain healthy, does it impact the polls because he has been somewhat dismissive of this pandemic in the past, and now it'll bring back the spotlight on COVID-19?
I think, so my sense of the polls is that there are so few undecided voters in America at this point. I mean, our estimate at Signum is sort of 4 to 6% of American eligible voters are still undecided. So it's a very small pool of people who might change their minds at this point because of the president's illness or his recovery. So we don't see this as having a big impact on the polls. I think most voters in America have decided. Over 1 million Americans have already voted, and Americans are voting at really high rates right now in early voting. So I think it's the window to sort of attract undecided and swing voters is rapidly closing, if it's not already closed.
What is the one thing, Lou, that you think could actually change everything? I mean, does it make it more likely? We already thought that it could be a very close race. Does it make it more likely that it could, even tighten the race further?
But if President Trump recovers and is back on the campaign trail in 2 weeks, I think we go back to where we were yesterday, which is Joe Biden with a very comfortable lead and leading in most of the swing states and winning the presidency with a very substantial or pretty substantial electoral college victory. If the president is forced to drop out of the race for any reason and Mike Pence then becomes the candidate, that I think would shake up the dynamics and would lead to a closer race. I still think Joe Biden would win because just given the amount of time that's left before the election, but certainly suddenly having a new candidate on the Republican side would change the dynamics pretty drastically.
Sonia, in terms of market reaction, are you expecting much more volatility in the days and weeks to come? And are you, looking at havens like yen where you think market participants will pile onto?
Yeah, I think we have to assume that volatility will be here to stay. And I think everything that Luke just said obviously makes a lot of sense. And it's very clear. The closer we get to the election date and the more it appears that Biden will win, then obviously the market will start focusing on the main kind of campaign action points. And it's the tax plans in particular that I believe will have an impact on equity markets. And this has obviously been a part of the Democratic campaign for since the beginning, but it's not really been reflected in markets yet. And I think the closer we come to the date, the more this will obviously move into the center of attention. And as such, yeah, it is about obviously at this point around protection, about hedging, and potentially looking at the risk profile of your portfolio. I think it's fair to say the political side is really adding to the concerns markets had over the health of the economy. And obviously we will get the latest labor market statistics this afternoon, but it's very clear that there's much greater attention to the long-term economic scarring that is resulting from the pandemic. And as such, really the political story is adding on top of this. But I would have thought that most investors have started to reconsider risk a while ago.
Sonia, Lou mentioned that there is a possibility, a very small possibility, but still a possibility, if President Trump becomes ill, even very ill, that he'll have to be replaced on the ballot. Is it something that the market is currently pricing in? Is it something that they're thinking about?
I think this is too early. I mean, we have to see that the news flow obviously only appeared overnight, and as such, I think we will have a look at how markets are reacting today. And I'm sure the market will not try to price in anything that is not supported by facts, i.e., the health of the U.S. president, and obviously that will only emerge over the next couple of days. But if that were the case, I think we have to assume that markets will react to it, and volatility again once more will, if anything, go up, because it's a completely new setup in the presidential race.
Yeah, and Lou, we have to be, of course, very careful about what we say and we speculate on. But worst case scenario, what exactly happens to the U.S. elections? It will still go ahead in November 3rd. If the president is not fit to be on the ballot, what happens?
So the election will go ahead. There's no sort of method to change the election date. If the president were unable to be on the ballot, the Republican Party the Republican National Committee would pick a new ticket, and they would almost certainly pick Mike Pence, Vice President Pence, to be the presidential candidate, and then would pick somebody else to be the vice president. So it would be a very last-minute switch of the ticket. And as I said, we think that could shake up the dynamic of the race, although this close to the election, I mean, it's just over 4 weeks away at this point, I think it's unlikely to change the outcome, and I think former Vice President Biden would still, win the election. But that's the process. The Republican National Committee would pick a new candidate, and almost certainly pick Mike Pence to be that candidate.
But Lucia, what happens to the people that have already voted by mail-in? I think there's over 1 million of them.
Right. So every state has different rules and different processes, and my understanding is that in most of the states, that the party that the person voted for would still get the vote. So if a voter had voted for the Trump-Pence ticket, and then between now and the election, that becomes a Pence, Nikki Haley ticket, they would still get that person's vote.
So do you think if it, could we see, I mean, again, this is, speculation at the moment, because we don't know how the president is feeling or any of the symptoms that he has, if indeed he has any, but would a Pence-Haley ticket be the one that would be most likely? And how does that change? I mean, it really changes the debate dynamic between the vice presidents coming up.
Well, it does, and I assume that this debate next week will continue. We'll go ahead with the vice presidents. Look, a Pence-Haley ticket would definitely change the dynamic, and I think a lot of suburban women who have been leaving the Republican Party and were Trump supporters 4 years ago, but have switched their allegiances to Joe Biden at this point, might reconsider if they were a woman vice president on the Republican ticket. So there are lots of ways that this could change the dynamic of the race. The pick would not. This is also hypothetical. The pick would not necessarily be Nikki Haley's, but certainly she would be in the running and would be interested in it. But I think there's so many different ways this could go, so that the speculation is a little bit fruitless at a certain point. And as you said, I think we'll see over the next week or so how seriously the president has this disease. He certainly seemed healthy and fit this week. So I think we'll have to sort of watch that and see how his medical condition progresses. But if he really is incapacitated and there is a new ticket on the Republican side, again, I think it changes the dynamic. It will tighten the polls, tighten the race. Ultimately, I still think Joe Biden wins the election.
Lou, who are you waiting for to give us updates on the president's health? Are we going to have it by tweet by the president himself, or is there going to be a task force, or how do people get alerted about, what the president has or doesn't have?
Great question. So I think two things. I think we will certainly see tweets from the president, and I wouldn't be surprised if he wakes up this morning and tweets that he's feeling great and he's isolated, but he's still working hard. And I think the White House spokesperson will be forced to do, if not daily, but I mean more than daily, regular briefings to the press corps with updates on the president's condition. So I think we'll start to see those happening. I mean, she's been fairly regular talking to the press anyway, but I think we'll start to see an uptick in the frequency of press briefings from the White House starting today.
Thank you so much. Lou Lukens, their partner at Signum Global Advisors, and Sonia Loud, Chief Investment Officer at Legal & General Investment Management, of course, stays us, and we'll talk a lot more about these havens and how you position themselves on this, frankly, pretty astonishing news day. Now, let's get straight to the Bloomberg First Word News. Here's Laura Wright. Hi, Laura.
Good morning, Francine. Well, yes, extraordinary news. President Donald Trump has tested positive for COVID-19. He tweeted that he and the First Lady both have the virus and will isolate. It isn't certain how he contracted the virus, but it comes after a close aide, Hope Hicks, tested positive. She traveled with the president to the election debate and a rally in Minnesota. The president's doctor says he expects President Trump to continue carrying out his duties without disruption. He said the president and First Lady Melania Trump will remain at the White House, where the medical unit will maintain a vigilant watch. He says he'll update on any developments. Responses are coming in on the news. European Council President Charles Michel is wishing the president and First Lady a speedy recovery. He says the pandemic is a battle we will all continue to fight. There's also been an unofficial response from China, from the editor of the Communist Party mouthpiece, the Global Times. He tweeted, "The president is paying the price for his gamble to play down the pandemic." It's unclear how President Trump's diagnosis will impact the election campaign. The test result will likely sharpen the already intense public attention on his handling of the pandemic. This will likely make it harder for the president to shift the campaign away from the virus to other campaign topics, such as racial unrest across the country. Global news 24 hours a day on air and at Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. This is Bloomberg. Francine.
Laura, thank you so much. Now, President Trump's physician says he expects him to continue his duties without disruption while recovering from coronavirus. Regardless, the positive diagnosis for the world's most powerful man throws a new wrench into the gears of an already chaotic election. COVID-19 has been especially risky for men, the elderly, and those who are overweight. Well, joining us now is Bloomberg's Intelligence Director of Research, Sam Fazeli. Sam, again, early days, because we literally found out a couple of hours ago that the president tested positive. But what kind of tests, what kind of worries would be circling in the White House right now?
Hi, good morning, Francine. So obviously the president is in an age group and body mass index group, let's put it that way, that potentially increases his risk of severe COVID disease and fatality from an infection. But those are not the only drivers of how this can pan out. Your initial viral load, the amount of so-called virion, inoculum, all these different words, the number of particles of virus that you are attacked by or that you've breathed in are a major determinant of how quickly your immune system can respond to it. If it's a lot, then you have a higher risk of suffering than if it was lower, which is why masks work. So those are the variables that we just don't know. We do know he's in the age group that has a higher risk of 5–10%, depending on which estimates you read, of fatality. But then, of course, the viral load is key also.
So, Sam, we know that, President Bolsonaro of Brazil tested positive. Boris Johnson here in the UK tested positive, and he was also in ICU for a couple of days. If you look at, Silvio Berlusconi, he also tested positive and recovered. Do we know why, some people react better than others? And, how much does it make a difference that he's president of the United States, so would be getting the best care and attention in the world?
Yeah, I'm sure, Francine, that makes a difference because, he's immediately going to be under the best possible care, getting the drugs that we now know reduce the risk of how long you have to be potentially in hospital, etc. So at the time where Boris Johnson tested positive, we didn't have any of that. Now, obviously, just like everybody else, you hope that no human being succumbs to this virus. But at the end of the day, the current medical therapy is a lot better than it was 6 months ago, and the president will, I'm sure, receive the best care possible. But your immune system is the one that decides eventually how bad the reaction is.
Thank you so much, our Bloomberg Intelligence Director of Research, Sam Fazeli. Let's go back to Sonia Loud, a Chief Investment Officer at Legal and General Investment Management. Sonia, I mean, this is, rolling news, a breaking news. We know very little, of course, and will be briefed throughout the day. When you heard the news, what was your first point of call? Was it actually this will add volatility and will stay on volatility? Or are there any havens that you think could actually help you right now?
No, I think for the time being, it's simply too early to tell. I mean, as your colleague Sam just highlighted, obviously we had a number of head of states that have contracted the virus, and Boris Johnson's experience probably has been different from some of the others. But clearly, if that experience were to happen to President Trump so shortly before the election, then it would be very interesting to see how markets react, just given the level of uncertainty on how this would work out. I think there's no obvious choice right now, because, as I said, it is not just the presidential election. There's a lot going on right now that markets are trying to put in the right context, not least the question on how strong the economic recovery will be into the fourth quarter and into 2021. Lots of debates around stimulus measures, which we know have been essential and instrumental in obviously moving markets and the economy forwards. We've just had another news last night, obviously, that the Democrats have put forward another $2.2 trillion in terms of stimulus measures, which has not been supported by the Republicans. So lots going on here that will have an equal impact on markets. But obviously headlines around the presidential election will add extra volatility. And as such, investors will probably have to brace themselves for a period of heightened uncertainty and volatility before we have a clearer picture emerging on the back of the election, hopefully, and early into next year.
Yeah, so Sonia, one of the things that we're trying to figure out, as you so well put it, is does it actually impact negotiations for the stimulus bill? Does it also impact possibly the Fed's thinking? I mean, could we see the Fed having to issue a statement at some point saying, we stand ready to act to ensure market stability?
Which I think they have anyway. If you think back, the last communication from the Fed clearly has supported the actions they have taken, and they always reiterated that they stand ready to act in order to support markets. Now, I think that the big question that markets are obviously currently grappling with is whether the enormous amounts of fiscal and monetary stimulus eventually will bring back inflation. Yet, as we know today, is that from an economic output gap standpoint, we're nowhere near closing this, and as such, there's no real price pressure emerging in the economy. So differentiation between the interest rate cycle and QE, and I think QE, none of the big central banks has indicated that they would dial back their support, and I think this is what the market is reacting to. Volatility mostly in equity markets for the time being. I think bond markets would react far more than in terms of the political direction of travel, and as I said, focusing very much on the economy and whether the output gap is anywhere near of closing.
Sonia, I know this is a really, very tough question because we sometimes don't know exactly what the president and his team around him are thinking. But could we see a President Trump that's much more belligerent towards China to make sure that everybody knows he's still in charge?
Yes, I think this is what we had expected, regardless, and obviously before we heard the news that he has contracted the virus, is around, making sure his stance towards China is well understood, and he's reiterated it a number of times, and I'm pretty sure we might see more of this, although too early to tell, because depending on how he feels, we might see probably a bit of a break in Twitter feeds, particularly if you consider how obviously Boris Johnson suffered throughout COVID-19.
I mean, we also heard this morning from, Boris Johnson trying to intervene in these Brexit talks to make sure that, or at least to give them a chance to break the impasse. Does it mean that, volatility because of Brexit will slow down a bit, or is the market just going to kind of latch on onto every little point and want to sell?
I think, so again, I would always differentiate between equity and bond prices and the reaction in those asset markets versus the currency, because I think it's very clear that the performance of UK assets in the equity market in particular have not really reacted to any news flow we had on the Brexit negotiation. And I think this is mostly related to the fact that international investors have disengaged with the UK now literally ever since the referendum vote, because it was so unclear on how this would work out, and the UK market is not big enough in an international context that it would be worthwhile to take a bet if you don't know how the political situation is. Now, the currency is a different story because it's always been the pressure valve to literally reflect the news flow coming out of the Brexit negotiations. I would think it is good news that Boris Johnson is reaching out to Ursula von der Leyen, and they've put on, I think, a video conference in for tomorrow, really signaling that he is ready to intervene and to make sure that we're dealing with the impasse that is still on the table.
Sonia, thanks so much for all of the update there. Sonia Loud, their Chief Investment Officer at Legal & General Investment Management. And of course, we'll have plenty more throughout the day. Now, this is a huge news story. It started about 2-3 hours ago when we found out, when the president tweeted himself, actually, that he had COVID. He tested positive for COVID, and Melania Trump also had it. We're clearly in a risk-off mood as markets trying to understand the implications of this. The dollar's gaining, and markets definitely taking a risk-off turn as they try and figure out what's going on. This is Bloomberg.
Another day of risk off across the financial markets. We bring you special coverage of all the price action and implications here on Bloomberg Television.
I was actually poor.
No foreplay?
Eat your bag of Lay's with a smile on your face.
If all the diseases have been taken, I'll take a tax.
COVID strikes the White House. Donald Trump tweets that he and the First Lady have both contracted the virus. Investors run for cover. U.S. futures drop, European stocks slide. Brent breaks below $40. The election is just over a month away. Treasuries and the yen gain. Money floods into havens as the president's positive test acts as a wake-up call for the markets. Well, good morning, everyone. These are live pictures from Washington, D.C., Capitol Hill. The news that we had in the last couple of hours, he announced, President Trump, via tweet, that he and the First Lady had tested positive for COVID-19 shortly after one of his closest aides had fallen ill with the coronavirus. So I imagine there are a lot of meeting rooms being taken at the moment, even if it is the dead of night, 4:30 a.m. in D.C. COVID, of course, has been especially risky for men, the elderly, and those who are overweight, raising the danger level for President Trump. It would also, if the president remains healthy, of course, have implications for the election November 3rd, because this campaign will be stopped certainly for the coming weeks, and also it could impact the polls. Now let's get straight to the Bloomberg First Word News. Here in London is Laura Wright. Hi, Laura.
Thanks, Francine. As you've covered extraordinary events this morning, President Donald Trump has tested positive for COVID-19. He tweeted that he and the First Lady both have the virus and will isolate. It isn't certain how he contracted the virus, but it comes after a close aide, Hope Hicks, tested positive. She traveled with the president to the election debate and a rally in Minnesota. Prime Minister Boris Johnson is holding Brexit talks with European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen this Saturday. The final round of scheduled negotiations are ending today with little progress. The Prime Minister is now intervening directly to try to break the deadlock. It remains to be seen if the two sides will be able to reach a deal. The UK's dominant industry is lagging behind in the recovery. Services firms saw slower improvements than manufacturers in the third quarter. That's according to a survey by the British Chambers of Commerce. Hospitality and catering companies were particularly hard hit. It suggests the government may have to step up aid to prevent a collapse over the winter. The US House has passed the Democrats' $2.2 trillion fiscal stimulus bill. No Republicans supported the package, and negotiations with the White House have so far failed to reach a compromise. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi says the vote does not slam the door on discussions with Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin. The death toll is rising in California as wildfires continue to blaze in the state. The Glass Fire in Napa Valley has now burnt nearly 57,000 acres and destroyed more than 240 homes. Further north, 4 people have been killed in the Zog Fire, which has set fire to more than 55,000 acres. Global news, 24 hours a day on air and at Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. This is Bloomberg. Francine.
Thank you so much, our Laura right there. Now, let's look at the market reaction. There's a clear risk-off mood. I don't know what exactly the market is pricing in, but there are so many questions that we need to find out and so little answers, because only 2 hours ago, or 3 hours actually ago, that we found out that the president and his wife, Melania Trump, tested positive for COVID-19. So let's really look in depth at the market reaction with our Danny Berger. Danny, what exactly is moving the most right now?
Francine, I mean, part of the problem here is, as you say, there's still so much uncertainty, but really equities in the U.S., that seems to be taking some of the bear of the brunt. Let me show you what they're doing. The December contract on the S&P 500 is down 1.2%, but really some of the higher beta assets here are what's dragging the market down further. Brent crude is down 3%. So you want to know which markets are moving the most? It's Brent crude and Russian assets as well. We're seeing, for example, the ruble down 1.4%, one of the worst performing G20 currencies. Equities in Russia also down 2%. I mentioned this before. SEB saying that a Biden presidency would be less favorable for Russia. So we're certainly getting that priced in. Now, Stephen Innes of AXI says that he would recommend investors go into havens right now. Look, we are seeing some haven buying. The yen at about 0.4% higher. That's not a huge move, but certainly a move to the upside. Another place you could look for protection is the VIX. And here I have the VIX curve for you. So this is basically going out different contracts on the VIX. So let's say you want protection out here next year, you'd buy this contract. So I have two curves to compare for you. The top one is the live curve, so you can see it updates as we're talking. The bottom one is yesterday. The interesting thing here is the biggest jump we get is in the front end of the curve. So this is the live spot VIX. Here we have 1 month out and then 2 months out. This kink in the curve right here is for the November election. So you can see traders wanting more protection for the election itself, but not just the election. They want it for the the months intervening, because there's some concern, as Sebastian Gailey from Nordea told us, that perhaps Trump steps up his rhetoric with China, becomes more tough during this period after he has contracted coronavirus. Now, other havens, though, we are seeing them back off. I mentioned the yen only up about 0.4%. Well, here is volatility on the yen, and that has backed down. It was more than 1.5%. It's now at about 1.2%. So these sort of haven buyings have relaxed a little bit. As Masanari Takeda of Nomura told me, hedge funds have really deleveraged after September going into October, so they can afford to sit on the sidelines and wait. And perhaps that's why we're not having as ferocious of buying as one might expect. At the same time, we're going to keep our eyes glued to the polls. Stephen Innes, who I mentioned before, also said he thinks Biden's chances of presidency in these betting markets could surge to 90%. Francine?
Danny, thank you so much. Our Danny Berger there looking at the markets. So joining us now is Elizabeth Braw. She's Senior Research Fellow at RUSI. Elizabeth, there are so many implications of this, and I guess the market is reacting because we just don't know what kind of symptoms the president has, how sick he could get. I mean, what are the 2 to 3 things that you want to know? Is it, whether it changes the polls or whether actually he'll be incapacitated?
Well, as you said, there are so many ramifications of this. First of all, will the election campaign be affected? Will he be able to return after these 2 weeks that he has to quarantine? And if not, I mean, if he really has COVID-19 and gets really ill, what happens? Will the election take place as scheduled, or otherwise, what will happen to the election? Then, second of all, the implications for the rest of the world. So your reporter just highlighted already what's happened on global markets with a decline almost everywhere. So what happens if this takes a more serious turn, if the president is really ill and can't execute his functions as president even during the election campaign? And so it's not just a matter of the people in America and the rest of the world sort of ridiculing Trump and saying that served him right because he didn't take it seriously. Actually, that's something we shouldn't do, because we will all be affected by this in some way if he does take ill.
Elizabeth, I mean, are we going to see a lot more testing? Is there a danger that actually we don't really know who, President Trump's aide has really been in contact with? Is this, another, it feels like every hour that we try and discuss, there are really many more questions than answers. What are we underestimating? That, many more people could have it? Or again, that we just don't know the severity of what the president has, how much, of the virus load he's been subjected to?
That's an excellent point. So he apparently got the virus from Hope Hicks, his communications aide, but how many other people in his inner circle has she been interacting with? So as we all know, the president and his inner circle and his family, in fact, are not really fans of wearing face masks. And in fact, Trump has often ridiculed Joe Biden for wearing a face mask. And oddly, in America, wearing a face mask is a political issue, whereas in most of the rest of the world, it's just what you do to protect your health. But so this sort of rebellious stance towards wearing a face mask is now affecting the Trump administration quite badly, obviously, beginning with the president himself. So I think we'll all be watching very closely over the next few hours and days to see how exactly his health has been affected and is likely to be affected. And then I think we'll all also be watching very closely to see who else tests positive for the virus.
Elizabeth, how could this actually impact the polls? So is the danger that, people are worried that the president is sick and not fit? Or does it put the spotlight back on something that the president had downplayed for months, which is the severity of the pandemic?
That's right. So he has been trying to limit the significance of the virus. Starting when it first arrived in America, he said, it will soon be over, and he has stuck to that narrative. Obviously, now that's going to be a whole lot more difficult, and in recent weeks in the election campaign, he was able to shift focus from coronavirus to the sort of issues that he likes to talk about. So law and order, and especially law and order. And now, of course, that's going to be extremely difficult because the narrative has turned against him. But I think it's not just a matter of the American election, it's a matter of global politics as well. So what does it mean for his ability now over the next couple of weeks to conduct policy on behalf of the US government? So we have a war that's erupting in between Armenia and Azerbaijan, and the US would ordinarily play a key role in trying to make sure that doesn't escalate. What does it mean when the president is not fully incapacitated, but at least partially so? And what does it mean, if, as I mentioned earlier, if he does take a turn for the worse? So it's there are so many aspects of this that hinge on this tiny virus that half a year ago we didn't even, or 12 months ago, we didn't even know about.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth Brother, Senior Research Fellow at RUSI. Now let's get straight to the Bloomberg First Word News. Here in London is Laura Wright. Hi, Laura.
Thanks, Francine. President Donald Trump has tested positive for COVID-19. He tweeted that he and the First Lady both have the virus and will isolate. It isn't certain how he contracted the virus, but it comes after a close aide, Hope Hicks, tested positive. She traveled with the president to the election debate and a rally in Minnesota. The president's doctor says he expects President Trump to continue carrying out his duties without disruption. He said the president and First Lady Melania Trump will remain at the White House, where the medical unit will maintain a vigilant watch. He says he will update on any developments. Responses are coming into the news. European Council President Charles Michel is wishing the president and First Lady a speedy recovery. He says the pandemic is a battle we will all continue to fight. There's also been an unofficial response from China, from the editor of the Communist Party mouthpiece, The Global Times. He tweeted, "The president is paying the price for his gamble to play down the pandemic." The diagnosis will likely dramatically alter the closing weeks of the presidential campaign. The president not only faces an unprecedented health challenge, but also logistical issues. The White House has cancelled political events today, including a rally outside Orlando, Florida. Fundraising trips to key battleground states are expected to be scrapped as well. Global news, 24 hours a day on air and at Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. This is Bloomberg. Francine.
Thank you so much, Laura. Now joining us to talk more about the markets and more about the developing story, of course, on President Trump and his wife, both testing positive for COVID-19. I'm delighted to be joined by Scott Thiel. He's Managing Director and Chief Fixed Income Strategist at BlackRock. Scott, good morning. How much more volatility will we get, given we don't know how sick the president is, we don't know how it impacts the polls, we don't even know if actually, you know, the Fed will have to step in and stabilize the markets if volatility continues?
Well, I mean, I think it's very interesting, Francine. Obviously, if we look at the reaction thus far, what we've seen is equity markets are sold off, but actually fixed income markets have been very, very stable, right? In other words, we have the VIX at around 28, 29, but the forward VIX is already well above that for the period around the election. But interestingly, Treasury yields haven't really fallen that much, and part of it is the uncertainty which you allude to, which is very difficult. There's many different pathways that this can obviously take, and I would obviously pause here for a moment and wish the Trump family well and hope that he and that President Trump and Melania recover quickly, because that's obviously the most important thing. But I do think from a market perspective, you know, in the opening hours of this news, it's challenging because, you know, there's so many different pathways. I would make one observation, actually I'd make two observations, one from a market perspective and one from a fundamental perspective. From a market perspective, again, the reaction in the Treasury market is relatively muted. And as we've been talking about before, is that the Treasury yield on March 24th, the day before the Fed announced its major policy initiatives, is basically where we are today. So we've been up and down a little bit over the course of the last 6 months, but the volatility in the Treasury market has been very low. And therefore, as a result, you know, the use of Treasuries as a hedging tool is something that we've been discussing quite a bit, you know, at BlackRock in terms of its effectiveness. And again, here's another example where you don't really, in this period, you haven't really gotten the same type of reaction in Treasury yields that you have in the past, partly because obviously yields are so low, and the Fed's policies are so pervasive in the Treasury market. I think that's observation one. The second is that actually, you know, one of the areas that we have been focused on in one of our themes, which we call activity restart, right, Francine, is the interplay of the virus outbreak and the economy. So this idea of mobility, right? So are people more concerned about the virus and thus it impacts economic activity? And to the extent that that this obviously very, very, case that's very pronounced and very important, when they focus, again, this idea about how, mobility does impact economic activity.
Scott, I imagine, I'm not that familiar with, White House protocol and how you test the people around the president, but I imagine, for most of the day, we'll have these kind of headlines. So Mike Pompeo saying the last time he was with President Trump was on September 15th, and we can now confirm that Mr. Pompeo and his wife have tested negative for COVID. They were just tested today. Scott, the other question, and this actually was brought to my attention by a viewer that wrote in, and I urge everyone, especially with this developing story, we're trying to figure out the impact of the markets, to write in. But he brought to our attention that given the tweet that we heard from China and saying, well, the president only can blame himself, let's bring that tweet up if we have it, that President Trump could react angrily towards China. Is this something that the market is prepared for, or would that mean just much more volatility? If actually, to get away from the virus spotlight, we see something escalating between the U.S. and China?
Yeah, listen, I think it's very hard to say what the kind of immediate outcome, and again, that tweet, again, I'm not going to comment on that specific tweet, but what I would say is that, Francine, one of the things that we have noted about this election process is that, Americans across the board obviously are focused on the U.S.-China relationship. It's not just a Republican issue. And so that's always been a source of volatility, and I think that will continue to be so. I think from a process perspective, obviously the succession has to be protected, right? So the Vice President, Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Grassley, for example, they obviously have to be separated from the president. But I don't know that we're, again, it's hard to speculate on who's been infected and then how that process has gone forward. But I would say that, again, volatility very high. But until we get some information around it, it's very hard from a market perspective to position, given the outcomes are very varied here.
Yeah, Scott, do you think the market is pricing in a winner for November 3rd, or are they, even before this, were they kind of on the sideline for the moment?
Well, it's interesting. It's a very good question because, the candidates are very far apart from each other on policy, right, as noted. And obviously the House Representative passing the fiscal package yesterday is an example of that, where they're very different ideas. And in our view, if Vice President Biden were to win and also the Democrats to take the Senate, we could have a very big fiscal spending package to deal with both the COVID crisis and kind of the ideas and infrastructure spending, green initiatives that Vice President Biden is been put forward as part of his platform. So in our mind, that scenario is not priced into the market as of yet. But more of a gridlock scenario is, where you have the president and the Senate at different parties, or at least there's not a clean sweep across the three different elected parts of the U.S. government. So the short answer is the polls suggest that, that Vice President Biden is winning the election, but the markets are not, in our minds, priced for this clean sweep, which is something that we think would have the biggest kind of change in markets and in policy if the Democrats were to have all three parts of the government. I know it's a kind of a strange answer, but you see what I'm saying? The sweep is the biggest change in policy.
Yeah, no, it makes 100% sense, and actually you said it very clearly, Scott, but if you look at, the impact this has on the stimulus package, does it make it less likely that we get a stimulus package in the U.S.?
You mean the president's illness? Yeah. I'm not sure. Obviously, it very much depends on the level of illness that he has, right? Whether he is incapacitated or not. But in that situation, obviously, Mike Pence would take over. So I don't know that it necessarily. I would be speculating, Francine, to say that it would impact the negotiations. I think, again, coming back to what I said originally, I think there's a very important takeaway from this is that, the reinfection rates and how that impacts the real economy, that is something that is in investors' focus. And I believe that regardless of the outcome of this, the president contracting the disease will focus investors more on this idea of activity restart and how the virus and reinfection rates play into economic activity and thus asset allocation. I think that's for sure an outcome of this. The other things are obviously very hard to speculate.
All right, Scott, thank you so much. Thank you so much for being also a really good sport, because we are trying to kind of, feel our way around to understanding what the implications of this is. One of the other things that we should focus on is, of course, whether this delays the reopening of the economy, just because a lot of governors will be concerned. Scott Thiel there, Managing Director and Chief Fixed Income Strategist at BlackRock. Now, for an update on the latest news, let's bring in Anne-Marie Horger. Hi, Anne-Marie.
Good morning, Francine. Well, as we've been talking about the entire morning, we do have news that President Donald Trump and wife, the First Lady Melania Trump, have tested positive for COVID-19. A few things we should remind our viewers. One is that the spokesperson for the White House has said that contact tracing is underway for both the president and Melania Trump. They obviously have big staffs and they travel frequently. Just this week alone, the president was in New Jersey, with Minnesota, as well as in Cleveland for that presidential debate. The second thing is that what happens next is usually a 14-day quarantine. The president was scheduled to have upcoming rallies October 2nd, Florida, the 3rd in Wisconsin, and the 5th and 6th in Arizona. Francine, I bring this up because this is very important. These are seen as battleground states. Joe Biden is up some 4 points in Arizona, according to a latest New York Times poll. Wisconsin, Biden is up 7 points, and Florida, 1 point. The question does Trump now take these campaigns and these rallies virtually to computers, to Zooms, et cetera? We know in 2016, these are really highlights of his campaign. And then finally, the third thing, and as Kit Jukes really pointed out, he spoke with me early in the 6 a.m. hour, is that Vice President Mike Pence likely will get a lot more attention, and that the vice presidential debate scheduled for Salt Lake City, Utah on the 7th, that becomes a much more high-profile event to watch. And finally, John Authers talked about this the entire morning. What happens with the fiscal stimulus deal? Does it muddy the waters, Francine, for those negotiations? Or is this new impetus for lawmakers to see that they're trying to get something done as the country battles COVID-19, including the country's president?
Yeah, Anne-Marie, thank you so much. Our Scott Thiel was also just weighing in on that. Now, joining us for more FX markets is Jane Foley, head of FX strategy at Rabobank. Jane, one of the angles that we haven't really been exploring that much is if you have a president, the most powerful man in the world, frankly, that tested positive, does it make it less likely that the U.S. economy can continue its reopening phase? So does the economy almost automatically get a hit because governors and states will be reluctant to reopen at this point?
I think that's possible, certainly because the market is, or just consumers are going to become much more nervous perhaps about COVID-19. Excuse me, and we've got to remember that this news about Trump comes on the heel of quite significant concerns in various parts of the world, including Europe, about a second wave, about the rise in COVID-19 diagnosis. So from this point of view, it is likely to underscore concerns. If the president can get it, oh my goodness, anyone can get it. But to a certain extent, I think it depends also about, how his health does progress over the next couple of weeks. If he remains well, I think there's going to be a lot of relief in terms of risk appetite. But of course, if he does deteriorate, then that really brings a lot of confusion. We've just heard that Pence's position becomes a lot more important. Who's going to be the winner of that vice president sort of campaign? That's something, again, which the markets haven't paid an awful lot of attention to. So very much it depends at this point about how Trump's health sustains over the next few days, the next couple of weeks.
Yeah, and that's something, of course, that we'll keep, continue monitoring very closely. Jane, how does it impact stimulus talks? How does it impact the polls? How difficult is it as an FX strategist to figure this out now?
Well, it's in a way you could argue, well, it's so sort of complicated, it becomes easy. And I say that because often when there is so much political uncertainty, well, investors just go for risk appetite, for safe haven currencies. So, we've already seen today, we've seen the yen moving, the Swissy, the yen and the dollar actually are the best performing currencies over the last month, suggesting that, because some of the headlines that we've had in recent weeks have been worrying the market already. Fears of a contested election, fears potentially that could bring civil unrest, the COVID connections, tensions with China. They've all been, hitting the headlines more. And this is just another bout of uncertainty, which is likely to really help those safe haven currencies.
So, Jane, do you just buy yen today?
I think the yen is probably a safe bet, not just because of Trump's health, but of course because of all of those other factors that I've mentioned. And to be honest, in terms of does it make the fiscal stimulus deal more likely or not, well, there are so many other factors too. I mean, what about the payrolls number today? If that is really disappointing, perhaps that will be the impetus that politicians need to sign off on a deal.
Jane, I mean, is it yen and Swiss, the havens par excellence, or is there something else that you would be hedging right now?
I think the yen, Swiss, and the dollar certainly in March proved itself as a safe haven. However, given the huge amount of liquidity from the Fed that we've seen, since March, the stress that we're going to see coming through in the dollar is certainly lessened. But it certainly can gain, particularly if we get more tensions with China, if we do get a contested election, etc., that the dollar can gain, and certainly there could be some short covering in the dollar given the movements lower that we've seen in recent months. But I think the yen certainly, and the Swissy also. The Swissy also got one eye on the EU's recovery deal. Will that be delayed? Will the sentiment in the eurozone that we saw over the summer, will that start to fray? There's various other factors in the mix, but I think the yen, the Swissy, and the dollar are all potentially standing to gain on bad news.
Great, Jane, thank you so much for the updates and all of the insight. Jane Foley, Head of FX Strategy at Rabobank. Great to have Jane's thoughts, of course, on this developing story where we're still trying to figure out the full market implication, but we're trying to get you what the markets should at least be thinking about. Another market move that I'm looking at actually is gold. Gold ticking higher. Again, this is as stocks are selling off in the U.S. because of this political risk, and that's, a sign that maybe the metal's long-term appeal stays. Bloomberg surveillance continues in the next hour. Tom Keene joins me out of New York. More of our top story, of course, throughout the morning. This is Bloomberg.
Another day of risk off across the financial markets. We bring you special coverage of all the price action and implications here on Bloomberg Television.
COVID strikes the White House, Donald Trump tweets that he and the First Lady have both contracted the virus. Investors run for cover. U.S. futures drop. European stocks slide. Brent breaks below $40. The election is just over a month away. Treasuries and the yen gain. Money floods into havens as the president's positive test acts as a wake-up call for markets. Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to Bloomberg Surveillance. I'm Francine Lacqua here in London, Tom Keene in New York. Tom, there's literally no other story in town apart from the fact that President Trump has tested positive, and we try and figure out the scenarios to try and figure out what the market should be thinking about. And I think we start from, the very beginning is either the president makes a quick recovery and we look at the polls and whether that impacts the election outcome, or he doesn't. And that brings us into the fog of actually what could happen.
Well, the fog of the medical statistics. And the one thing we know, Francine, is we are all much, much smarter than we were in March or February of last year. And those are distressing statistics for a 74-year-old, whether they're president or not. Trust me, I got a lecture this morning on my way into work about these risks of age and weight. And the number one message I would have this morning worldwide is not what you or I think or all the good people of journalism. It's what the medical people think. And they are 1 week out. They are 1 week out. And then they are in search of pneumonia. The linkage of bacterial illness with this virus is what the pros are worried about.
Yeah, Tom, of course, we wish everyone sick a speedy recovery, but that's a very timely reminder. Now, we'll have plenty more on that. And on that, let's get straight to Bloomberg First Word News with Ritika Gupta. Hi, Ritika.
Hi, Francine. Tom, more on that stunning news from the White House. President Trump says he and his wife Melania have tested positive for the coronavirus. That happened shortly after a close aide, Hope Hicks, fell ill with the disease. The president's doctor says the president and First Lady plan to remain at the White House. He said President Trump will continue to carry out his duties without disruption. In London, a warning that the city is at a tipping point when it comes to the coronavirus. Residents are being told to take immediate action to avoid catching and spreading the disease. The warning underlies fears that the virus has taken off again because Britons were not following the rules on social distancing. And it is the last U.S. jobs report before the November election. The numbers are expected to show a sharp deceleration in labor market gains. According to analysts surveyed by Bloomberg, employers probably added 875,000 workers in September. That's down from almost 1.4 million in August. The jobs report is out at 8:30 New York time. And the House has passed a $2.2 trillion Democrat-only stimulus package. The vote came after talks between House Speaker Nancy Pelosi and Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin failed to yield a bipartisan agreement. Pelosi insists the vote won't slam the door on negotiations. Democrats have been demanding more spending than Republicans will accept. Global news 24 hours a day on air and Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Ritika Gupta. This is Bloomberg. Francine, Tom.
Ritika, thanks so much. I don't want to oversell the shock of the data. Right now, what I would say is there was a shock as described by the 10-year yield with the recent non-elasticity of yield from a 0.68 and off the shock of the announcement earlier this morning in the United States down to 0.65, 3 basis points, but we have come back a little over halfway from the initial shock. There is a market reaction. There's no question. We are off the bid, but not like you would think. Futures negative 38, Dow futures negative 311, 2 points on the VIX, back to 28.68. Francine, in the currency markets, as you can imagine, dollar churning, and I note sterling on a bid, which I guess would be expected.
Yeah, so, I guess the Brexit news out there, and we understand that Boris Johnson will also intervene to try and break the impasse between the UK and the EU. That will be, put to one side because the focus is firmly on the US and President Trump. I think we saw ruble, for example, in Russia internalizing some of the virus results, oil slumping, gold holding up. We could do a data check all day, but the various mood is that you're right. We're not, we're off the day's lows, but still a lot of risk aversion as the market tries to figure out. There's so many questions, Tom, and so many, so little answers at the moment. I think that's what the market is trying to grapple with. So 31 days left to go until the election. President Trump tweeted that he and the First Lady have tested positive for COVID after one of his closest aides had contracted the virus. Now, Trump tweeted that he and Melania will begin to quarantine immediately. The White House has canceled all public events, including a rally in Florida. Joining us now is Peter Trubowitz. He's LSE Professor of International Relations. Peter, how should we look at this? So we don't know the symptoms that the president has. We don't know the viral load that he's been exposed to. If the president is okay, if he recovers without, anything to worry about, will that affect the polls and the campaigning?
Yeah, look, I'm happy to talk about the election, but I think the central issue here this morning is continuity of government. Obviously, the first concern is the president's health. At 74 and overweight, he's in a high-risk category by the CDC's yardstick. We should keep in mind that half the people in this age group, only about half, show symptoms, and only 20% in this age group end up in the hospital. So while I know the markets are going wild this morning, we should take a deep breath and keep that in mind. Having said that, the president's vulnerability does put the issue of continuity of government immediately before us. The 25th Amendment grants the administration the power to temporarily transfer authority to the vice president if the president is medically incapacitated. Now, if Trump has been exposed, one has to worry that Vice President Pence may very well have been exposed too. The next in line would be Speaker Nancy Pelosi. So I'm assuming as of this morning that both Pence and Pelosi are in self-isolation. I think that's extremely important. Now, if you want me to turn to the electoral implications, I'm happy to do that.
Let me just jump in. I mean, you're right. I imagine that the U.S., and we know because you've just laid it out, and we knew this ourselves, is that there's a list of people that would take the president's place if he's incapacitated. What we don't have a rule book for is if he cannot be on the ballots because 1 million people have already sent their votes by mail. What happens then?
Well, it gets very messy and very complicated. I mean, I think there's you can think about the electoral implications in terms of Donald Trump being asymptomatic and that's, the scenario where he recovers and so forth. And then maybe we can turn to the scenario, which is a pretty dire scenario. I mean, I think the immediate electoral implications, they really do depend on how Trump fares medically. And also, I should point out here, I think, on whether Biden contracted this from Trump on the debate stage Tuesday night. I mean, Donald Trump was shouting a lot during the debate. And just to go back to Tom's point at the top of the hour about what the experts say, we know that increases the risk of a carrier spreading the virus. I think the immediate consequence of all this is that Trump will not be campaigning for 14 days. That if he is going to campaign, to the extent that he campaigns, it will be virtually. This is clearly a problem for the president, who trails Biden badly in the polls and all but self-imploded on national TV on Tuesday by failing to reject white supremacy groups. I noticed this morning, I mean, Trump took a hit in the presidential betting markets right after that debate, but he's in free fall this morning when you look at it. I don't see how this helps Trump, to tell you the truth. I mean, I think some people will feel sorry for him, but I think this was an accident waiting to happen. He flouted his own experts' guidance. This is a predictable result. To borrow a phrase, this is a known known. And, tens of millions of Americans watched Trump on Tuesday night mock Joe Biden for wearing a mask. I think the question for Biden is, well, Tom, you want to jump in?
Well, I want to jump in, Peter. We were just showing images of the Secretary of State of the United States, not really part of the 25th Amendment debate, but nevertheless, Mr. Pompeo, I'm sure, will be visible. We'll have more on that. We're a little unsure whether that was taped or a live image of Mr. Pompeo. Professor Trubowitz, to the 25th Amendment and Section 4 of that amendment, which really shows a process where the vice president and other officials basically alert Congress to the challenges of any president. Now, we all agree we're very distant from that right now. But there has to be a process with Dr. Connolly in the coming hours to begin, as they say, his convalescence. How will the people around him adapt and adjust on a Friday morning to the good doctor and the president's convalescence?
You know, Tom, I mean, you ask a great question, and one really does, with this White House, one just simply does not know. I mean, I think, though, that what you're raising is a larger question about the 25th Amendment and the Constitution. And the truth is, it doesn't really offer a clear procedure for determining whether a president does the possibility of a legal fight if it came to a transfer of power. Again, though, I think it's very easy to rush down this path.
Yeah.
And we're very early days here. The president so far is asymptomatic, as you pointed out at the top of the hour. The first week is the easy week. The second week is the complicated one. But I think we need to be careful that we don't rush down there too quickly.
A constitutional lesson from Mr. Trubowitz at the London School of Economics. Dr. Trubowitz, thank you so much for joining us this morning. And this, of course, is things that the nation has never considered. We showed Dr. Connolly's comments earlier. Of course, the president's personal physician from Notre Dame. Of course, highly esteemed, particularly in emergency room medicine. No doubt we will hear from Dr. Connolly today. We have so many voices coming up now that it will be extraordinary to see. And of course, all of this over a jobs day. We will have, of course, our usual guests here as we move in and out of this developing story with the President of the United States and Mrs. Trump. Kudlow in the 9 o'clock hour. Stay with us.
defying this retail downturn?
The function of luxury, I think, since the very beginning is the same, is to give pleasure to people. And probably in this period of time, people need pleasure more than ever.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance. Tom and Francine from London and New York. Tom, of course, there's one story in town, and this is President Trump and his wife, Melania Trump, testing positive for COVID-19. It did ripple through the markets. Some of the markets now recouping some of the losses, but again, so many questions, and it's only 5 a.m. in New York and Washington, so we need to try and figure out what the day will bring. To help us do that is Joyce Chang. She's JP Morgan Chair of Global Research. Joyce, I guess what we can only do at the moment, and thank you so much for waking up early for us, is to try and figure out what the questions are that we need to know. So we don't know how sick, if at all, the president is and will be, and what that means for the election.
No, well, first of all, we hope that the president and the first lady do stay healthy. They have shown to be asymptomatic, but just let me lay out a few of the things we're looking at. First of all, we need to know what the full extent of the outbreak is. There have been so many meetings between the debates and the fiscal package, reports that Hope Hicks had met with Nancy Pelosi. So is this going to be disruptive to both the Republicans and the Democratic side? It's been out that Mark Meadows, the chief of staff, has tested negative, but they have to do the whole contact tracing and just really see how this, how disruptive this could be, and whether things can kind of, proceed as had been planned, given what these new developments are. So that's one thing. But the second thing I would say to watch is really how this could impact some of the Senate races, because that's really where it looked like there was a toss-up. And is this a potential break in some of the Senate races? Now, we've looked at, for example, the Democratic candidate in North Carolina raised a record amount of money very recently. This has actually changed the odds for the Senate, and that's where the markets will focus, because a lot of the questions that are about, tax cuts, the fiscal numbers, I mean, that requires Senate approval, the current phase 4 of the fiscal package right now. But ultimately, I think for a lot of foreigners and people in the U.S. watching all of this, they see this as a referendum on how well the institutions are working in the U.S., how well the processes are going to work, and that's what they're going to be focused on in the next few weeks.
Joyce, does this actually also, delay the opening of the U.S. economy? So our government, are certain governors and states going to decide to either close down shop because they're afraid, because they see their president sick? And what does that mean for the economy?
Well, I think that you are seeing, in Europe, we're seeing the resurgence of COVID-19, but in parts of the U.S. that also had been happening as school opened. So that debate was already underway before this. And, we have had the view that your output's going to remain below full recovery until there is, more of a solution, a health solution to COVID-19. So I think what you were already starting to see after all of this stimulus was more divergence and asymmetry. And I think that's really what's in store as we head into the end of the year and looking to 2021, as far as how we could see economic performance, also corporate performance, and even at the household level. More divergence after what really was this record fast sell-off and record fast stimulus.
Joyce Chang, thank you so much for joining us. We welcome all of you worldwide, as the head of research of JP Morgan is with us at this most interesting time for the nation. Joyce Chang, what this comes down to in the coming days with the great unknowns that we have is what the shifts will be if the president sustains in strength, or if the vice president takes over, or if we have a Biden victory. No one knows that great uncertainty. For the markets and for our financial system and our banking system, does this politics uncertainty actually matter? Is the outcome over the bridge into 2021 pretty much the same, given Trump or given Pence or given Biden?
Well, we had just put out a report on this recommending that investors should be hedging some of the volatility risk around these elections. But ultimately, we think that you stay long risk here and you put on these hedges, and that's irrespective of what the outcome is. So, this is one more thing that's going to make the noise, pick up. But, we don't see something that, even if you see more questions about the reopening, we don't see something like a nationwide lockdown in place. We do think that the central banks are going to stay, very accommodative. And we do see that, the numbers that are printing now and even the jobs number that we're looking for will continue to show some improvement. But that is sort of the global story, but then there's a divergence within that. You're going to have some real asymmetry and divergence between, at the regional level, which countries are performing well, and North Asia has stood out in its outperformance. That's going to continue. At the corporate level, too, small businesses have been sort of left behind, but we've had that your earnings have been strong in other places. So some of these big macro trends, I don't think are going to change with the election outcome, but it is a test of the institutions.
Right. I think, Joyce Chang, within the shock of what we've seen in the last 4 hours of after JFK and into LBJ, when there was a time of great action, can we have an equivalent shock here and somehow find a stimulus package, some form of compromise here out of the shock of our leaders so ill?
I think the two sides are just too far apart. I mean, 2.2 trillion on the Democratic side and 500 billion on the Republican side. I think that is too hard a gap to close, and there's too many other things that are going on right now. And beyond the fiscal stimulus, I mean, you have the Supreme Court vote. You have that Obamacare is supposed to be before the Supreme Court, around November 10th, 11th. And what happens with that? So I would, we have phased out phase 4, and that's meaningful to the economic numbers. We've taken down the fourth quarter growth in the U.S. from 3.5% to 2.5%, and first quarter 2021 growth from 2% from 2.5%. And we think that household spending drops by about 12% in the fourth quarter.
Wow. We're going to have to come back just on that topic. That is a new idea for me. I missed that from the research of J.P. Morgan. Joyce Chang with us, and we'll continue, of course, with the thoughts from one of America's major banks. This historic moment for the nation. A president is ill. Coming up on Bloomberg Surveillance, we are thrilled to bring you the World Bank president, David Malpass. Again, many more guests here from the world of virology and medicine. And also, of course, this Jobs Day, we'll speak to our usual wonderful guests. Stay with us worldwide. This is Bloomberg.
The scale of the climate crisis is just staggering, but you can't let that be an excuse for doing nothing. So to fight climate change, we can't be overwhelmed by the seeming impossibility of the task at hand.
Inclusive multilateralism is about bringing more voices to the table, resulting in more ideas, more solutions, and more climate action.
As a signatory to the Global Covenant of Mayors, Charlotte has joined thousands of cities and regions in a commitment to accelerate ambitious, measurable climate and energy initiatives.
Local communities across our nation are stepping up in unprecedented ways to respond to the ongoing challenges of our climate crisis.
We'll see what is the cost, what is the reliability, but without innovation, a lot of innovation, we won't be able to get there.
COVID-19 has disrupted a generation of workers, hitting younger people the hardest, and the interruption will take a financial toll.
I think there's already some damage to young people that's going to take them a decade to reverse.
There's a real threat to what's going to happen to these folks throughout their career.
I'm Lisa Abramowitz. Join me for Generation Interrupted, a special report this weekend on Bloomberg Television.
CPG history, their experience, and really how we might be able to combine together to really create this fantastic public company. And so we kind of got into the SPAC thing a little bit before it became such a hot method of going public.
This is a market that over the past few weeks has made it clear it wants to go higher. It got a little spooked by the idea that geopolitical tensions are rising.
This This is Bloomberg Surveillance. I'm Rishka Gupta with your Bloomberg Business Flash. Today, Walmart reportedly will announce the sale of a majority stake in its British grocery unit Asda to a consortium led by TDR Capital. The price, about $8.4 billion. All that according to Sky News. One of the losing bidders was private equity firm Apollo Global Management. Walmart has been looking to sell Asda for at least 2 years. The European Central Bank will start experimenting with a digital version of the euro. At the same time, the ECB will hold a public consultation in a major step toward introducing the technology. Cryptocurrencies such as Bitcoin have spurred a close look at how payment technologies are developing. General Motors may revise its deal with embattled electric truck startup Nikola. Bloomberg's learned that GM may seek a higher stake in the company. Nikola's valuation plunged after allegations of deception. The company's shares are down more than half since the deal was announced September the 8th. That's your latest Bloomberg Business Flash. Tom Francine.
Ritika, thanks so much. A deterioration in the tape. Of course, we had a sharp deterioration at the 1 o'clock hour off of the president's tweet on the illness that he has with the First Lady. And now with negative 37, we're now down to negative 42 on SPX, down negative 334. The VIX out two big figures, which I would think is appropriate for that kind of move, 28.85. Dollar fractional strength there with a safe haven sense. I would note the real yield, that inflation-adjusted tip, has come back to a more negative statistic, a negative 0.98 on the 10-year yield. Francine?
Yeah, Tom, I'm looking at spot gold ticking higher. Of course, the stocks still selling off on this U.S. political risk. They're selling off less than they were about an hour and a half ago, but still something that we need to keep an eye on. The other thing which the market won't really be focusing on is, of course, Euro area CPI readings for September, giving the markets yet another reason to feel gloomy, but frankly, the data will necessarily take a backseat compared to U.S. politics today. Coming up on the Open with our Jonathan Farrow, Mohamed El-Arian, Bloomberg opinion columnist. That really great interview is coming up at 9 a.m. in New York. That's 2 p.m. in London. And this is Bloomberg.
De esta manera me gustaría decirle a los empleadores que fueran más humanitarios con sus trabajadores, que les hagan valer sus derechos. Y estábamos viviendo en dos casas, en unas 50 personas y en la otra otras 50. En cada casa había 5 habitaciones. En cada habitación había de 3 a 4 camas abarrotadas. Vivíamos de 6 a 7 personas. Un baño para cada habitación y una cocina para todas. Una vez que nos atendieron en el hospital, al salir nos avisó una compañera que ya nos habían reportado a migración. Gracias a Dios ahorita de salud yo estoy muy bien, pero en lo moral no estoy muy bien, porque a causa de esa enfermedad yo perdí todo, perdí mi trabajo. Yo creo que mi caso resulta un gran problema de cómo las personas migrantes estamos en riesgo de explotación por parte de los empleadores.
a sense of the real-time action. The 10-year yield tumbling now 11 basis points, so continuing in this knee-jerk risk-off feel.
Good morning, all. Bloomberg surveillance from London and New York. On an historic day, the President of the United States is ill with the virus, as well the First Lady in the last number of hours is sick as well. And of course, we go into a study further of this virus and of the medicine around it. Futures at -46 and have deteriorated in the last hour. I would suggest many safe havens are contained with Euro Swissy, one of those indicators, quite quiescent. The dollar relatively quiescent as well, but we're continuing to monitor markets. I would note American oil, West Texas Intermediate finds a new low, 37.42, down $1.30 on oil. We are most fortunate that she was up early. Who knows why? Joyce Chang is with us with JP Morgan, ahead of all of their research ability. Joyce, you know, we're all getting up to speed here on, frankly, a good healing for the president, but also the idea that it may turn and go the other way. What would you presume to be the economic reactions if the president's condition deteriorates in the next 10 days?
Well, I think it's going to put more focus on where are we at with respect to finding a vaccine and how quickly that can go. So we have 9 leading drug manufacturers that are in phase 3 of the testing. But in talking with our biotech analysts, who I strongly recommend that you speak with, Corey Kasimov, he really sees this as something that's late 2021. Yeah. So I think it puts more focus back on the virus first and where we are at. And even though you're going to continue to see positive headlines on the vaccine, that rolling this out wide scale, that's still something that is really a process.
And Joyce, one of the highlights of our week was just a wonderful conversation with John Norman about the correlations within the market, and they all seem to spin around this American difference with Europe, which is we are struggling to find stimulus. We are struggling to find aid to aggregate demand with all the layoffs. It is Jobs Day, folks. And yet Europe seems to be fairly comfortable with income substitution or income replacement. Could that be a change in the United States off of the president's shock?
Well, I think, look, we've already seen these sea changes from both the ECB and the Fed, which we've talked about, Tom. I mean, markets are always going to want more and ask for more, but what we haven't seen is that any of this has actually brought inflation back, but it has ensured financial stability, and that's kind of where this comes to. I mean, is so much of the objective now just to assure stability. So I think there is that debate right now. I mean, EU Recovery Fund, does that mean more of a fiscal union? In the U.S., we're looking at if a Biden administration comes in, that his Democratic terms would be about another $2 trillion on the deficit over the next decade. And that's looking at the Penn-Wharton numbers. So I think you will have this, discussion where we have blurred the lines really between monetary and fiscal, and also, you have this unusual coordination, which we haven't seen before in crises, between the central banks and the Treasury as well. And so are we really looking at things that are sea changes here from the way that we've used to look at it? We've seen the language change. We saw Lagarde's comments that, the extraordinary is now normal. We've seen the Fed change its framework, all of these strategic frameworks that are changing. So I think we are in to see, just more discussion on, the fiscal measures that will need to be forthcoming in the aftermath of this crisis. I mean, we still have output about 4 percentage points below where it was pre-pandemic at the end of 2021. So this fiscal discussion is going to stay with us.
Joyce, if President Trump's health deteriorates, we do have a template for how you move power to the vice president. What we don't know is actually, possible constitutional chaos. How would the market, what exactly is the market pricing in right now? Are they, discounting worst case scenario, or is it something that the market will wait today to find out exactly, the severity of what we're living through?
Look, I think that ultimately this referendum is going to be, this election is going to be remembered as a referendum on how well the American institutions are working. as well as who they're working for. So you had even before this like 300 different lawsuits that had come up on the absentee ballots, the early mail-in ballots. So yet this is one more test, and I think that the markets will be looking very much at just the processes play out as they should play out. The timing on the elections, you rest with the Congress on changing that. You don't have a period of bipartisan cooperation that's that evident right now. So a lot of the things that we're watching are not just at the presidential level, but what plays out at the congressional level, and that's in many ways more meaningful for markets as far as just sort of the types of market-moving events that will be passed later related to, tax reform, increased infrastructure spending, and these kinds of measures.
Joyce, we also saw a tweet from the Global Times of China where a lot of support came in for President Trump, wishing him a speedy recovery from leaders around the world. And then the Global Times said, well, if President Trump, I don't know if we have the tweet, it'd be great if we did, but if President Trump has COVID, it's because he wasn't careful enough. Is there a danger that, Trump takes this badly, retaliates, and we're 33 days from the election with actually a lot more also tension between the U.S. and China on trade?
Look, the U.S.-China tension is here to stay. I think that is one of the dynamics that is not going to go away, in part because the China recovery was first in, first out, and really does look like one of the truly V-shaped recoveries. And we've had just the issues on democracy and human rights as well as the tech issues. So, whether it is Trump or whether it is Biden, I think that tension is here to stay. Now, to escalate that right now, 6 weeks before the elections, I think this changes the focus. I mean, it changes the focus to actually making sure just that the American processes are functioning the way that they should function. And, they're going to need a lot of questions. I mean, Tom had asked about the questions. Will the debates continue as planned? And it's a different election as well, because everybody's saying, well, it all happens election night, but you have that early voting means you're going to see some of these early voting counts and sort of news about that, and who's requested the ballots, which side, Democrats or Republicans earlier, like a couple weeks earlier than just watching election night.
Joyce Change, thank you so much. Let's bring up that tweet again if we could, as we were showing it here on Bloomberg Television. Dr. Chang with JP Morgan, and we thank you for your attendance today. This is a timely tweet from China and the Global Times, considered to be a path for the government to speak to the world. The president and the first lady have paid the price for his gamble to play down the COVID-19. The news shows the severity of the U.S. pandemic situation. It will impose a negative impact on the image of the president in the United States and may also negatively affect his reelection, the opinion of half a world away. There'll, of course, be many, many more opinions through the day. We'll be monitoring that for you on this horrifically busy day, including Jobs Day as well. And, of course, we'll speak to many medical experts about the path forward for the president and the first lady. With our first word news in New York, here's Ritika Gupta.
Thanks, Tom. More on that stunning tweet from President Trump early today. He tweeted that he and his wife Melania have tested positive for the coronavirus. That happened not long after a close aide, Hope Hicks, fell ill with the disease. White House physician Scott Conley says the president and his wife plan to remain at the White House, quote, during their convalescence. He also says he expects President Trump to continue to carry out his duties without disruption. The last jobs report before the U.S. election may suggest the winner will inherit an increasingly shaky economic rebound. According to the median projection of analysts, employers probably added 875,000 jobs in September. That's down from almost 1.4 million in August. We'll get the jobs report at 8:30 a.m. New York time. And the Trump campaign says the commission that runs the debates is biased against the president. It's criticizing proposed changes for the next two events to limit the president's interruptions, including a mute button. But the campaign's not threatening to boycott the debates. President Trump has come out and condemned the Proud Boys, a militant group that supports him. That came 2 days after directly declining to condemn white supremacists during the debate. The president told Fox News he condemns condemns the Proud Boys, the Ku Klux Klan, and other white supremacists. Global news 24 hours a day on air and at Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Ritika Gupta. This is Bloomberg. Francine, Tom.
Pretty good. Thanks so much. Now, coming up, we'll be talking to Wolfgang Munchau, your intelligence director. We'll talk to him, of course, about President Trump and the First Lady having COVID-19. This is Bloomberg.
Some things you see coming, some things you don't. The trick is to be ready for anything. Pablo from Infrastructure Support is working every day to keep essential market data flowing seamlessly. We keep on, so you can keep on.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance. Tom and Francine from London and New York. Tom, we look at the markets and actually traders are pondering the Trump shock and what this means for their markets and their positions. And I have to say the markets are a little bit calmer than they were certainly 2-3 hours ago when we found out that the president tested positive for COVID-19. Now, for some much needed perspective, we're joined by Wolfgang Munchau, your intelligence director. Wolfgang, you know, there are many questions, many questions of who the president potentially could have infected, many questions on whether this plays out in the polls and what happens so close to the election. What is the one thing that, you know, you'll be watching out for today that you think the market is missing?
Well, I mean, first of all, what you just mentioned, has he infected anyone else? He had a debate with his opponent, Joe Biden. They were standing apart, but he has met with many people, so that is clearly that would be a very different scenario if both contenders were infected. The question is how the public reacts to that. It's not clear at all. There is a presumption that this is bad for him, and that would also be my first thought. This is bad for him, but on the other hand, we have seen in the UK, where I'm based, we've seen when Boris Johnson got infected, that initially boosted his popularity. His popularity declined later when he mishandled the crisis, but it was actually, there was a lot of sympathy with him, and there would be an element of a sympathy vote when that happens. This may not be enough to win an election, but it's certainly an element that would be on any market strategist doubt. It's not a clear-cut thing. This is why the markets are not pushing this in one extreme direction, as one might have expected just on listening this for the first time. This is one of the events that could go both ways.
But Wolfgang, are you more worried about the leadership in the coming weeks of, you know, the U.S., or are you worried about the implications about, you know, on the election? If there's constitutional chaos, it's very unclear what would happen.
Indeed, there are obviously extremely concerning scenarios where there would be a constitutional crisis. I believe the U.S. has provisions for even a worst-case scenario. So one wouldn't have a constitutional crisis, but a very severe political crisis, a political vacuum. The vice president would be in charge. So nominally, the government would continue. But it's not it would add further to global instability. That's no question. But I don't think this is the big blow up for the global economy.
I would separate them out as well. Wolfgang Munchow, of course, alluding to the 25th Amendment, and we'll get into that on surveillance through the day. It is an extraordinary document manufactured in about 65 out of the assassination of John F. Kennedy and, of course, LBJ taking over. And it was a pretty fractious process to come up with the 25th Amendment, Section 3 and Section 4 of major focus. We don't need to do that right now, because with Wolfgang Munchow, we've got to always digress to this odd thing called Brexit. John Farrow had put me in the timeout chair, Wolfgang, for bringing up Brexit, but it seems to be pretty germane right now. What is the new interpretation that you have on the challenges across the channel?
Well, the Brexit, the negotiations are, ending today, this current round, with no progress. There has been a bit of optimism expressed. I didn't believe any of that, because it is basically the political advisors briefing journalists. It has nothing on the ground has changed. This will be decided. I'm still believe a deal is possible, but this will not be decided by advisors, but this will be decided by Boris Johnson himself and the leaders of the EU. Both will have to move. Both will have to move beyond what they said they would accept for there to be a deal. That is possible, but it's also accident prone. Because it is well be the EU has been telling itself for a very long time that that these are red lines are for real, that it doesn't want to have a trade agreement with such a large country on its doorstep without any guarantees on state aid and level playing field and all these other commitments. And the UK has really, everyone is telling themselves about being completely independent from the EU and cutting off from EU regulation, yet doing a lot of business with them and hoping to get a lot of concessions. So these are unrealistic expectations on both sides, and they will have to, both will have to climb down. And it's really open to say what they say to each other on closed doors. This could go either way. And it's not 50-50. It's really, in the sense, we don't know. But we know that a deal requires both sides to have to admit to their own, cheerleaders that they didn't get everything they wanted.
Wolfgang, what's your timeline on this? I mean, as an American, I'm sort of like bored. Francine keeps me up to speed on this wonderfully. Yes. But what's your timeline on this after all these important dates? How far does the can move down the road?
First thing, never believe a European deadline. They say end of October. Now, the timeline is mid-October. In exactly 2 weeks, the EU leaders will meet again. That's where the big political summit will be on Brexit. That's where they will hopefully change or adjust the negotiating mandate and have maybe even talk to Boris Johnson in advance or after that meeting, so they can have some high-level breakthrough at the political level, not at the detail level. Right. These guys are not details people. Then they go. Then the hope is, if that happens, if there is this sort of political breakthrough, that both the teams, the negotiating teams, go into what's known as a tunnel or sort of some submarine activity. But this is basically where they don't talk to the press, where they basically lock themselves away in a secret room. That usually takes 2 to 3 weeks. So we could have, if everything goes to plan, a deal by the end of October. Now, if there isn't this political breakthrough, things will continue. I don't think they will give up. Everyone will step up their no-deal preparations, but there will be continuous diplomatic activities, and I think it is possible for them to still strike a deal in December. Now, things will be slightly mad. The implementation of the deal, the ratification in the European Parliament, this would have to be done in record time, But this is nothing compared to the you know, nobody will let this fail because you know, we are running out of days to actually having discussions. Yeah. December is pretty much the deadline.
With a nice walkthrough there of the chronology. Wolfgang Munchau, as always, thank you so much for joining us with Euro Intelligence and, of course, writing often for the Financial Times. It's simple. The markets deteriorate. We were negative 30-something, now negative 53. Dow futures at negative 406. And really of note is Brent crude getting down near a 36 print here. The low in September, early September, was 36.13. We're not there yet, but with a 37.13. That's Brent crude there. West Texas Intermediate is 37.13, down $1.59, which really gets my attention. On this Jobs Day, we are thrilled to bring you Ellen Zentner of Morgan Stanley. I believe Kevin Cirilli scheduled to be with us as well on the illness of the First Lady and the President. Stay with us worldwide. This is Bloomberg.
It's really a reminder, isn't it, just how sensitive the markets are to any commentary about trade. We did see some pressure on the yuan, we did see some pressure on the futures. That is now being reversed.
We're still alive, and we're still talking, and I'm hopeful that we can reach an agreement. We're still fighting for more money. We think that the administration is coming in far too low for our heroes. For our crush the virus, I think we're close in terms of money. We're yielding on that quite a bit, but close on that, except we have to see the language.
A Speaker of the House from a different time, speaking with our David Weston, Nancy Pelosi, 80 years old. And then there's Charles Grassley of Iowa, who enjoys his 87th year. They are the focus this morning as the First Lady and the President of the United States have the virus. Joining us, our constitutional expert, Emily Wilkins from Capitol Hill. Emily, we're all boning up on the 25th Amendment, maybe coming out of the hidden illness of Woodrow Wilson, of course, the tragedy of the JFK assassination. But as Greg Vallier mentions this morning, with much more, the assassination attempt on Ronald Reagan in 1981. What would you expect to see on Capitol Hill today from the Speaker of the House and the Senate pro tem?
Well, from both of them, I'm sure that, they obviously would probably want the president to get well soon. I mean, this is coming at such a critical time in the campaign for Trump to get this diagnosis. He's trailing in national polls. He's trailing in a number of swing state polls. This could keep him off the campaign trail for 10 days. The White House is canceling all public events. At this point, the First Lady did tweet out that she and the president do feel okay, so this might be a case where both of them have it, but they don't show any symptoms. But this now remains to be seen, and this is going to be a huge news story for the next week.
Emily, what does this mean for stimulus conversation and actually stimulus negotiation?
So the House yesterday passed that $2.2 trillion bill. It was a very partisan vote. All Republicans voted against, including some Democrats who were upset that it wasn't a bipartisan bill. We're not expecting this bill to be taken up by the Senate, but Pelosi and Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin have continued negotiations. They were talking last night. They were exchanging language. So they are still desperately trying to get something done here. You saw the White House come up a little bit on its offer yesterday, and they're fiddling with still with the language for state and local funding, as well as for various healthcare provisions and small businesses.
Emily, I look at the shock here and the tumult as well, and it's just mind-numbing to know that a debate is in 13 days. You're knee-deep in this in the Beltway. How will Vice President Biden react? Do you have any gauge of if he suspends campaigning?
I think that's a great question at this point, exactly how Biden does respond, because you have seen his campaign just kind of recently really scale up, get Biden out there, get Biden out on a campaign trail. I mean, this has been a very cautious campaign that Biden has run from the perspective of keeping healthy, where he's done a lot of virtual events, a lot of events from his home. So now Biden finally seems to be getting out there, and just as he is, Trump, who, so it'll be interesting to see that.
Emily, thanks for a quick brief. Emily Wilkins from Congress and Capitol Hill. Of course, we'll hear much more from there today. On this Jobs Day, coming up, Professor Krosner of the Booth School. This is Bloomberg. Good morning.
This is Bloomberg Best, your weekly review of the most important business news, analysis, and interviews from Bloomberg Television around the world.
Ken Burns, welcome to Bloomberg Big Decisions.
We have always been a mixture of things. We are always stronger for that mixture.
Growth is a way to stay competitive, delight more and more consumers.
Welcome to the Best of Bloomberg Technology. I'm Emily Chang.
They've moved the needle by acknowledging that they have to monitor the content.
What is one word of advice you'll take with you?
Learn how to listen. And that is certainly something that has served me well.
Ankiti, where do you go from here?
It's a huge market. It's a huge opportunity. I want to go 100x from here.
Our philosophy is to partner where we can and stand apart when we should.
Some things you see coming, some things you don't. The trick is to be ready for anything. John from Infrastructure Support is working every day to keep essential market data flowing seamlessly. We keep on, so you can keep on.
The second half will be a lot stronger than the first half in China. We're heading to what we call the golden season of auto sales.
We are very confident, we're going to have another big growth 2021 versus 2020.
We did not see people kind of holding back.
Chinese customers are into, right now, buying individual mobility.
This morning and now, the president, he is ill with the COVID-19 virus. He is in, quote, convalescence at the White House. His medical team, quote, vigilant. What does it mean for campaigning? What does it mean for a debate in 13 days? What does it mean for the nation? Ryan Teague Beckwith on the Trump campaign joining us momentarily. It is Jobs Day. There have been many firings. And into the fourth quarter, we slide this historic, exhausting 2020. Good morning, everyone. This is Bloomberg Surveillance from our world headquarters in New York. I'm Tom Keene, Francine Lacroix in London as well. And Francine, I know we've heard from Prime Minister Johnson, who has tragically a little too much experience with this terrible virus.
Yeah, Tom, as we try and figure out what the market is, of course, trying to also look at, which is, does the president, stay fine? Does he recover if he gets sick? What are the implications for the election? And just what are the implications for the leadership of the U.S.? I think it is always useful and a good thing to look at other leaders that have tested positive and how they've differently reacted to it. Boris Johnson, one of them. The other, of course, President Bolsonaro of Brazil.
We've got a number of medical experts coming up, and I will say to all of you waking up to this across America, the real determinant here is a 1-week gestation for every patient, and then the tip point for the medical professionals is the bacteriology of pneumonia and overlaying pneumonia on this terrible virus. Of course, the president nowhere near there at this time, and he rests at the White House this morning. On the data right now, very simple. We have deteriorated. There's no other way to put it. Negative 57, Dow futures negative 439, a plunge off of the president's tweet of quarantine earlier this morning, and then a recovery, and we now roll over. And I'd note, Francine, as well, West Texas Intermediate 37.07, oil down $1.65. Francine, what do you see?
Yeah, so markets are a little bit calmer, right? But that could be ratcheted up again with the jobs data, Tom. I think we're seeing more volatility as New York is also waking up. I wanted to show you pounds just because there is a bit of news on Brexit. And the other thing is I need to look at gold ETFs. I know we don't look at it very often, but it's holding on to gains. Because investors are weighing Trump's diagnosis, even as the dollar takes up. And so there are so many questions and very little answers, which is why, the markets are still nervous right now.
Very good. We have so many people to speak to today, and we'll be doing that through the day. Of course, John Farrow speaking with Lawrence Kudlow on Jobs Day, and that will be a different conversation in the 9 o'clock hour. But right now, we go to the trenches. Ryan Teague Beckwith is the one who has been on the campaign trail for the president, and we're thrilled that he could join us this morning for a brief. Ryan, did you see this coming? I mean, the idea that Ms. Hicks had the virus, and then the president got it, or the president had the virus and Ms. Hicks got it, in the swirl of a maskless or relatively maskless campaign, did someone like you so attached, did you see this coming?
First thing I would say is just that I think everyone's thoughts and prayers are with the president and the first lady, and we hope that they recover and that this turns out to be one of those mild cases that some people are lucky enough to have, and he certainly has the best medical care there. I think that those of us who have watched the campaign and watched the White House have been concerned that the protocols there have seemed lax. I think you don't have to go far to find photographs of members of the White House, members of the first family, not wearing masks or wearing them like where you can find photos of, for example, of Ivanka and her children wearing a mask and Jared Kushner not.
Right. Just because of time, I want you to describe Duluth, which I believe was a huge success for the president. There's all the things that will be canceled in Florida and Wisconsin. On the road to Duluth, in clearly a large crowd, clearly maskless as well, how exposed was the president at that event?
You can see that they walked to Marine One without wearing masks in a group. He says that he wears masks at those times when he needs them, and there's times where we don't see what's going on behind the stage. And I think there was that one photo that was taken of him where he was touring a plant and he was wearing it and he didn't know that he was being photographed. But they just don't. They haven't. They don't take it seriously. I think there's even a video of the White House Chief of Staff mocking a reporter for wearing it. The president has been known to tell people at press conferences to take the mask off before you talk to me because I can't understand you. He doesn't. He has not worn masks diligently, and he has mocked the idea of wearing masks. So I think that for the times that we don't see it, I don't think that you can guess that he was wearing the mask diligently. And the times that we have seen it, he's not wearing the mask. So, no, I would imagine that a lot of people in the White House right now are possibly exposed.
So, Ryan, let's just talk about what he had coming up in the next 2 weeks, because the president tweeted that he would self-isolate, that he'd put himself in quarantine. Is he missing crucial campaign pit stops in swing states?
Yes. I mean, we are just slightly over 30 days out from the election. The president, part of his campaign pitch was that he was maintaining a vigorous schedule. They mocked the vice president for what they say calling a lid, which is days where he wouldn't be campaigning. The president liked to say, he said, I'm working my ass off. Like he would hold multiple rallies. He had multiple rallies scheduled. One of them he just canceled because it was to a coronavirus hotspot, and the mayor was saying, please don't come. So there's the debates that are coming up. The next debate is between the vice president and Kamala Harris, but there was one the week after that and one the week after that. We don't know how you could possibly hold those in person. There's just so much. And then there's just the daily activity of being president, which he was using as part of his campaign. There's a lot of things where he was signing an executive order or calling the people in unexpectedly and saying, I have an announcement to make, which this will also complicate. But it's the president, and with this president, I don't know that we can just assume that this means that he's going to be, taking it quietly and resting. I mean, this could mean that he spends 2 weeks tweeting up a storm. I mean, we don't know.
Ryan, thank you so much. Our Bloomberg political reporter there, Ryan Teague Beckwith. Now, to get more perspective on the fact that President Trump's age and weight could make it particularly dangerous for the president, we're joined by David Nabarro, the WHO Special Envoy for COVID-19. Mr. Nabarro, thank you for joining us. I mean, this is really a spectacular news day with the president tweeting that him and his wife have tested positive for COVID-19. The president seems to be in a risk group just because of age and weight.
Well, I'd just like to start by saying how much I personally, as a public health doctor, really wish the president and his wife well, and I hope they recover quickly and that they have a really uneventful experience with this virus. And that's what I feel about everybody, but I'm particularly concerned that world leaders do not get badly affected by it. So I wish him well, his wife well, and of course Hope Hicks as well. I hope she recovers quickly.
But give us a sense of how, is he at risk? Is he, does he have a much higher risk profile because of who he is and what he's done so far?
Yeah, we want everybody to treat this as a dangerous virus. We know that people, for example, in my age range, older than 70, with perhaps associated illnesses, if they have them, they face higher risk. We know people with an elevated body mass index face a higher risk. So, of course, we want everyone who is at risk to be particularly careful, and that means, and most medical practitioners know this now, it means keeping a close watch on all vital signs, but particularly how well the body is being oxygenated. We want to also make absolutely certain that the isolation is complete,
right,
because we don't want others to be affected as well.
Dr. Nabarro, I want to dive into the statistics here of the 74-year-old, 244-pound gentleman whose BMI index is right on the edge of obesity. He is slightly obese, according to the statistics. Without question, the overlay risk is pneumonia. My working statistic is 15% of virus people get pneumonia. But what percentage, Dr. Nabarro, of this high-risk group find pneumonia? What is the percentage for those over 70?
Well, you've got the figures, and I mean, I don't think we can actually, in this situation, compare any one individual high-profile person with enormously well-advanced medical technology to support them with others in society. It's much better to consider the challenges he's going to face. And those will be potentially, as you've described, challenges associated with a stiffening respiratory system, which is less easily able to get oxygen into the blood. And so the medical personnel will be constantly looking at how that's working. And the most important thing they will check is how much oxygen is there in the blood.
Dr. Nabarro, very quickly, just because of time, based on your decades of experience with this, should Dr. Conley admit the president to Walter Reed, or can he convalesce at the White House?
I would suggest that this is managed in the residential setting unless there's any deterioration in the vital signs, particularly the functioning of the respiratory system, but also others as well. And then hospitalization at an early stage would be appropriate. Thank you.
Dr. Nabarro, is Joe Biden also at risk, given the proximity that he had towards, to the president during the debate?
All that depends on how physically close they were during the different parts of the debate. We who were able to observe the proceedings on television do not know what level of physical contact there was. We also do not know at what point the patient was infectious. And so I can't comment on that from where I'm sitting, but I'm absolutely certain that the contact tracing process will have looked into that and therefore will have assessed whether or not others, particularly other individuals, were at risk.
Dr. Nabarro, President Trump is not the first head of state, of course, to contract the disease. We had Boris Johnson of the UK. We had, Bolsonaro of Brazil. What have we learned about what, a head of state protocol should look like?
Well, and the most important thing is just to say to everybody, this is a virus that can affect any individual, whatever their status in society. And we happen to know that leaders have been affected, but we also know an awful lot of really poor people have been affected as well. And so this virus is dangerous. Everybody is at risk. We must all do everything we can to avoid being caught by the virus and being infected. And we must also make certain that if we are infected, we do not infect others.
Dr. Navarro, we've got to leave it there just because of time. We're running short of time, but thank you so much for your perspective, just particularly there on the medicine forward for the First Lady and the President. Dr. Navarro, of course, with the World Health Organization and associated with Oxford University. Futures deteriorate, negative 57. Dow futures, negative 429. And we're really beginning to see some movements in the markets. The yield market is pretty much stable. We'll get through that here in a bit. Oh, yes, it is Jobs Day. Ellen Zentner will join us later on this morning in the 9 o'clock hour. This will be a different conversation. Our Jonathan Farrow with Lawrence Kudlow of the White House. Again, a different conversation. The president has the COVID virus.
We explore the trends, investments, and competition of the European ETF industry. Join us on Bloomberg ETF IQ Europe.
I think what we've seen during this period of time is that communicating via video is not a fad. We are using it in all aspects of our lives, for work, for learning, for communicating, for staying in touch.
Good morning, everyone. Bloomberg Surveillance. Tom Keene in New York and Francine Lacroix in London. Of course, extraordinary news flow, not only the battles of Brexit on the continent of the EU and the United Kingdom, but of course the shock 4 or 5 hours ago now of the President of the United States announcing that he and the First Lady have the virus. It has completely encompassed all of the newscasts forward. They are resting at the White House. It is a most challenging news day, and of course part of that is the American labor economy, the challenges that we see in weekly claims, and of course this Jobs Day. Randall Krosner joins us now from the Chicago Booth School. He is wonderful on our financial economics, and that of course means the dynamics of the American system. Randy Krosner, what is the elasticity of our labor economy now? It seems like corporations are finding it very easily to jettison employees. What does that signal about the path forward?
Well, certainly we saw this enormous initial spike in the unemployment rate, and then with 22 million jobs being shed within the first couple of months, and then we've gotten back about halfway, about 11 or 12 million jobs, and so it shows a lot of ability to move in and out of the labor market. I think much more so than in much of Europe or in the UK where I'm sitting.
The microeconomics of this, Professor Krosner, are always extraordinary. The media, of course, spends 110% of their time on the supply function. There's also a demand function for labor. Has it changed?
Well, I think in certain industries it has. I think the shock of Corona is something that's going to have long-lasting structural impacts on the economy. So I think for a very long time going forward, transportation sector, hospitality sectors are going to be significantly smaller. Other sectors have been booming. The tech sectors have been hiring people. So this has been a bit different than a typical recession where sort of most everything turns down. It's really been dramatically different across the sectors.
Professor Krosner, how does the president actually now having COVID-19 impact the U.S. economy? Does it open, later? Will it make people stay at home more? Will it impact consumption?
Well, I think when Boris Johnson was diagnosed with COVID and then was hospitalized, I think that did have an impact on people's behavior because there was a lot of uncertainty about, well, how important is the virus? Can anyone get it? Or someone else can get it, but not me. And then if you see the leader of a country getting it, I think you start reassessing your chances. And so my guess is, without any formal lockdowns, people will be much more careful about going out.
How will the Fed look at this?
So the Fed's, they're facing a lot of challenges, all the fiscal uncertainty and now this additional uncertainty with the president having COVID and what that might mean for people's behavior and subsequent responses, as well as how that might affect any further fiscal response. So what I think they're doing is they're doing, as they always do, a lot of scenario planning, look at different possibilities. They have their estimates of where they think employment will be at the end of the year and economic growth will be. But I think there's a much bigger picture question of just how is the economy going to evolve, not just this quarter, but over the next year. And I think there are a lot of challenges. And I think Jay Powell made it clear that he thinks there are a lot of challenges also.
Professor Krosner, what is your estimation of how our system works with nominal rates near the zero bound? Obviously, people like you are saying it is not efficacious to go to a negative interest rate. People like you have as a former government official, as a former governor of the Fed, you have a story to tell of confidence in our institutions. But what is your confidence that commercial banking can prosper with the labor economy and with nominal yields set so low?
I think that's a really important question. So we could learn a little bit from some of the countries like in the UK and in Europe, where interest rates have now gotten low, or in Europe have been negative. The banks have been able to continue to make profits and make loans. Obviously, they would like rates to be higher, but a lot of the way that they make money is the difference between the longer rate and the shorter rate, the so-called yield curve. And so that's one of the things that in Japan they did with the yield curve control. The long rate is at zero, and the short rate is slightly below that. And so in principle, since banks borrow short and then long, they could still be profitable. But there are a lot of uncertainties about how something like this would work in the US, because the money markets are so much deeper here than they are in Europe or in Japan.
One more question, if we could, Professor Krosner, and this goes to the glide path of the unemployment rate. There's the U3, the U4, the U5. I don't care, Randy. What's the U Krosner look like? What is the unemployment rate of this nation, according to the acclaimed Krosner Index?
Well, I think there are different. As you said, there are different ways to measure it, and we know that people started looking at these broader measures, the so-called U6 measure, and Janet Yellen had focused on that a lot when she was chair of the Fed. I think we're seeing right now, by traditional metrics, an unemployment rate in the 8% range. It's likely to still be around in the 8% range with the new report that's coming out today. What that suggests is a very, very significant increase from where we were. And I think the key is going forward. I think it's going to be a long slog and slow recovery in the labor market because of these structural transitions. It's not something that, like the transportation and hospitality sectors, are just going to come back like that. And so I think making those transitions and also making geographic transitions from inner cities to edges of the cities and to the suburbs, that's going to take time. And so I think it's going to be a tough slog in the labor market.
Randy Krosner, what does inflation look like next year in the U.S.?
So it seems that, well, if my forecast as well as I think the Fed's forecast is a reasonable one, that we're not going to get a really strong recovery. I'm hoping that I'm wrong. I'm hoping that the Fed's wrong and that labor market will recover more. But if it is along the kind of path that I've been describing, I think we're going to see very little inflation pressure, despite the Fed buying lots of assets and putting a lot of reserves into the system. I think it's going to be much like after the global financial crisis. Fed's balance sheet exploded, but we saw low inflation rather than high inflation.
Professor Krosner, thank you so much. Thrilled to have you every Jobs Day. He is with the University of Chicago Booth School and, of course, a former Federal Reserve System governor. The data is simply deteriorated. There's no other way to put it. We were negative 30-ish when I walked in the door. Of course, the shock about 1 a.m., 2 a.m. Wall Street time was greater. But now we've really outdistanced that. Futures negative 61, Dow futures negative 470, and the VIX now out 3 big figures to a 29.87. We are finally seeing correlated deterioration in the bond market, really across all of the maturities. The 10-year yield is out 2 basis points on a flight to quality, a lower yield, a higher note price of 0.66%. Even the 30-year bond now comes in 3 basis points. Dollar fractionally stronger. And Francine, you're even seeing it with a stronger sterling, which is a surprise given the news flow.
Yeah, I think, Tom, the one thing that we need to look out for is, of course, some of these havens. I'm looking at gold. I'm looking at gold ETFs actually set to hit a record high as havens are in demand. I'm looking at yen. I'm looking at Swiss franc. The other thing I'm looking at is, frankly, FX volatility. That could rise further. So if you look at currency hedging costs over the 1-month tenor jumping today as they really try and figure out exactly what happens in the U.S. election, and they now envelop this, if you look at, currency hedging out for a month. Investors are finding themselves, I guess, in need of chasing a market higher as they were pricing in a relatively calm October. That will no longer be the case after the president tweeted that he and his wife tested positive for COVID-19, Tom.
Oil, 36.90 West Texas Intermediate is beginning to threaten the early September levels. A 35 print there would be extraordinary. As Francine mentions, there is no other story of the day. The First Lady and the President rest at the White House at this time. Sean Connolly, their doctor, is suggesting convalescence, maybe a word from the 19th century. And, of course, all of us, with a very healthy president, we should say, clearly fully having his capabilities, we're all brushing up on the 25th Amendment as published on what to do when a president is ill. What we will do, again, is to look at the medicine of the moment. Andrew Peckhouse of Johns Hopkins University will join us later. It is Jobs Day. Stay with us.
Ada 3 kelompok pengungsi tersebut yang sudah berpencar arah. Kemudian kami dari Polsek Banda Sakti berkoordinasi dengan perangkat desa Kampung Jomblang melakukan upaya pengumpulan secara persuasif serta minta tolong kepada warga. Alhamdulillah warga yang terpecah semuanya berkumpul.
defying this retail downturn?
The function of luxury, I think, since the very beginning is the same, is to give pleasure to people. And probably in this period of time, people need pleasure more than ever.
Valuations, particularly, sort of the technology landscape, have gotten to some pretty extraordinary levels. So I think it's not a surprise. I don't think it's any indication of the beginning of the end, but I do think markets don't like uncertainty.
This is a market that over the past few weeks has made it clear it wants to go higher. It got a little spooked by the idea that geopolitical tensions are rising.
Good morning, everyone. Bloomberg Surveillance, Francine Lacroix in London. I'm Tom Keene in New York. We welcome all of you worldwide and across the nation to an America in shock. The president has the virus. As well, the First Lady, we should point out this news breaking 6-7 hours ago. What we're going to do is do what we do best, which is try to speak to experts. We will speak with Andrew Pekosh of Johns Hopkins University on the pneumonia overlay here in a moment. But right now, on the political overlay, are Kevin Cirilli, our chief Washington correspondent. Kevin, I do not say this lightly, and I say it with respect for the institution. What does the president's day look like?
Well, they're figuring that out right now, Tom. The staff in shock, the campaign's in shock as America wakes up to this reality that President Trump and First Lady Melania Trump have tested positive for COVID-19. In terms of the immediate implications of this morning, it will be one of the options that is being weighed is whether or not Americans will hear directly from President Trump this morning.
Yeah.
And another option that is being discussed is where that will occur. The president, through the statement of his doctor, have said that they are quarantining and following the guidelines that have been put forth by CDC officials. We have also had a statement in the last several hours from the First Lady herself. Obviously, plans of immediate engagements have been canceled. Now, spinning it forward, and there are so many unknowns, that includes campaign events, that includes campaign travel, and if you spin it forward, it raises questions about the future of the debate.
Well, Kevin, what's so important to me is the relationship that this president has with his doctor that's always been fractious in our history, including, frankly, Reagan years ago in 1981. What is the relationship of President Trump with the doctor from Notre Dame, Sean Conley?
Well, any president, any first family, any senior staffers and employees of an administration are always receiving the best possible care in terms of medical treatment, and so they will be receiving the best medical care. You mentioned President Reagan. This is without question the most serious public threat to the office of the president in terms of a sitting president's health that this nation has experienced since Ronald Reagan's attempted assassination. And so this is a country that will be round the clock monitoring every second of the president and the First Lady's health.
Kevin, do you have a good understanding of who needs to be tested? Is it the whole of the White House? Who also was on that plane bringing President Trump to the debate? And what do we know about Joe Biden?
Well, in terms of who was on that plane, it included senior members of the president's staff. It included prominent members of Congress as well as other top officials. I mean, typically the executive branch has been receiving rapid tests. They have been receiving multiple tests according to sources that I'm talking with. And so those rapid tests will be executed today and deployed today. And so, you know, a lot of people have to get tested today.
Yeah, including Joe Biden. Do we know anything? I mean, they did a couple of days ago a face-to-face debate where I think they were 8 feet apart, but there was quite a lot of shouting.
Well, that at this time, I don't have the reporting to answer that question, but I'll get back to you in the next hour in terms of whether or not the Biden orbit, how they will be reacting to this. They have put out a statement expressing condolence in terms of the severity of this.
Kevin, there is a ballet to this, and with great respect for the institution, and of course coming out of the 19th century and Woodrow Wilson, as you mentioned, Reagan of 1981. There's a process, there's a dance, but this is a different president with a very small group around him. How does his group, Mr. Meadows, Mr. Kushner, and the others, how would you presume in the next coming days they will react to the Speaker of the House, the Senate Pro Tem, Charles Grassley, and others curious of his health given the 25th Amendment?
Well, you know, I think two things. First and foremost, there is an expectation that that they be forthcoming with information as it is developed, and that includes all of the health monitoring for the President of the United States, the First Lady, and any other individuals who have been in close proximity to the president, to those infected, and that is divorced from politics. However, the second point, as you raised rightfully on the issue of politics, is there is a countdown to an election, an incredibly volatile election. And so as it relates to that, they will have to be communicating directly to the public in a way that, quite honestly, maybe would need some new channels beyond just social media feeds. Voters want to hear directly from the president, directly from members of the First Family, and that is going to be a hurdle that they have to clear. And of course, first, they have to recover.
Kevin, you know, we've lived this in the UK with Boris Johnson being sick and actually also ending up in hospital and in intensive care. At the time in the UK, there was a large sway of sympathy towards the Prime Minister. Could President Trump benefit in the same way as we get into the election?
Well, I want to be clear. Everyone is wishing well for members of the First Family in Washington, D.C. Everyone has extended condolences, and we've seen that trickle in throughout the evening as well as throughout the hours of the early morning. I think it's a bit too early to tell in terms of, I don't have polling data, nor do I have any data to report in terms of how this would impact. But you correctly, Francine, bring up how the UK had handled this, and that is a model potentially that the president could follow in terms of how to communicate with the public.
Kevin Cerulli, thank you so much, and what will be an arduous day, our chief Washington correspondent. The greatest risk here of someone 74 and 244 pounds, a body mass index right on the edge of obesity, is pneumonia. An authority from the Johns Hopkins University Bloomberg School of Public Health, Andrew Pekos, joins us now. We should point out, of course, Mr. Bloomberg is a founder of Bloomberg LP and has been wonderful in his philanthropy to Mr. Pekos' institution. You've got this nailed, Andrew, and that is the microbiology of pneumonia. How does pneumonia react with the virology of the COVID virus is the major risk to the president?
Well, as you stated, we know the president is in one of the high-risk groups for serious consequences of SARS-CoV-2 infection. We know that it's really going to be now a process of monitoring. We want to see how the symptoms progress. We know that when it comes to a few days down the line, there's a turning point where your own immune system begins to drive some of the symptoms that you're feeling, and it's that sort of fulcrum point that'll be critical to watch for. We all hope that this turns out to be a mild to moderate case, but again, he's got a staff of doctors around him who'll be monitoring for all these changes that might hint at more severe disease.
They're the macrolides, and of course, we all have heard of Zithromax with our family that have been sick with pneumonia. Do the effective drugs of pneumonia, are they less efficacious with a virus?
Yes. Viral pneumonia and bacterial pneumonia are treated in very, very different ways. And the progression of disease in COVID-19, again, starts with the virus, but it ends up being driven by aspects of your own host immune response. So the drugs that are effective early in COVID-19 often aren't effective late, and you have to rechange the thought process in terms of how you're treating individuals as the disease progresses. Now, if there's a good part of this story, it's that the U.S. medical community has learned a tremendous amount about how to take care of COVID-19 patients, both in mild as well as severe disease, over the course of the last 6 months. So hospitalization rates have been going down, death rates have been going down. Some of that is due to demographic shifts in infection, but a lot of it is due to doctors now knowing how to treat their patients and get better results from the more severe cases.
Andrew Pekos, just so I'm sure that I understand correctly, I mean, does the President of the United States, does he have a better chance of of this disease not turning ugly because of the care he's getting, as opposed to, the common person on the street?
Well, he's obviously got a staff that's completely devoted to keeping his health as the #1 priority. So I think that's a great advantage. Obviously, he's going to be having doctors talk to him on a very regular basis over the next few days. And again, everyone hopes that the course of infection here turns out to be more mild and moderate. Another thing to mention, though, is we're talking about the president a lot about his symptoms, but the other thing that has to go on right now is the contact tracing. This appears to be an event that was localized in a number of different settings where lots of different people were coming together under conditions where the virus could be transmitted. So we should also remember that behind the scenes, public health officials are now going to have to go into overdrive to find the individuals who are potentially in situations that could have been exposed and get them into testing protocols as soon as possible, because, again, this is a very important part of our federal government, and we need to make sure that these people are being tested early so that the infection chains can be terminated, as well as now focusing on caring for the people who are infected.
The U.S. is also one of the most divided countries when it comes to mask wearing, whether it's effective, whether it infringes on civil liberties. Will this change the narrative of the United States and the regulations around it?
I certainly hope so. You see me here with my mask around. The data is quite clear that masks and social distancing work to reduce the risk of transmitting SARS-CoV-2. It's not something we all enjoy doing, but it's something that is effective. And as an epidemic wears on, we get a little fatigued for these things. But we have to realize that there are effective ways that we can limit transmission of this virus, and we just have to really double down and really redevote ourselves to utilizing these things in an effective way.
Doctor, I'm sure the low point for you in the debate was the back and forth between the two candidates over the ventilator. People like you are knee-deep in it. I'm sure you know that horrific sound of ventilators under stress in an emergency room in any given hospital. If the president deteriorates and goes on a ventilator, we're afraid of those things from February and March of this year. Do we have a better knowledge of use of ventilator now if someone gets pneumonia, if someone has this virus?
Absolutely. And it's clear that getting on a ventilator is a very poor prognosis for a person. But we now know that there are a number of different things that we can do instead of putting a person on a ventilator, which have shown a much better prognosis in terms of outcome of disease. So yes, there are lots of things that can be done now before ventilator becomes a necessity, and all of those things have been associated with better outcomes.
Dr. Pekos, thank you so much. Greatly appreciate it with Johns Hopkins University. Francine, I find it extraordinary how our conversation on this medicine is so different than it was in February or March. Even dummies like you and me are a little bit smarter about what's going on.
Tom, you just have to remember that, in February, March, we knew so little about the disease, and, we learn, frankly, every day and almost every week, thanks to people like Andrew Pekosh that are doing, deep research. So we still don't know enough to truly understand, why it hits people badly and why people are, others are asymptomatic, but we understand the treatment certainly much better than 5-6 months ago.
It is Jobs Day. We've got much good conversation coming up.